Hello guys, welcome to The Fiction Wizard. Today we have an incredible story for you. Morticia and Gomez Addams raided Privet Drive with dark lawyers and found 81 child abuse violations live. If you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. Let's get into it. Chapter 1, The Letter in Dried Tears. The Raven arrived on a Tuesday, which Morticia always said was the most melancholy day of the week, and therefore the most honest. It came through the drawing-room window at Addams Family mansion, a window that was never quite closed, because Morticia kept a small colony of moths she was particularly fond of and they needed the night air, and it landed on the back of Gomez's chair with the gravity of something that had been flying for a very long time. It was not a postal raven. It had no tag, no band, no official markings of any kind. What it had was a letter tied to its leg with a ribbon the color of a bruise, and when Morticia untied it and held the envelope up to the candlelight, she could see that the paper was stiff and buckled in a way that paper only gets when it has been soaked and dried. Soaked and dried several times. She didn't open it immediately. She held it, feeling its weight, tilting her head in that way she had, slow, serpentine, the way a woman listens to something that hasn't spoken yet. "Gomez," she said. He was on the other side of the room, in the middle of a passionate argument with Lurch about the correct way to tune a harpsichord to achieve maximum funeral resonance, but he turned at the sound of her voice the way a compass needle turns north. He always did. He crossed the room in 7 steps, took her hand, pressed his lips to her wrist just above her pulse point, and looked at the envelope. "Dried tears," he said immediately. "Yes. Someone wrote this crying." "Someone wrote this crying repeatedly," Morticia said. "This letter was not written in one sitting, Gomez. Look at the tied lines. They stopped. They came back. They stopped again." She turned the envelope over. No address on the front. Just a name, written in small, cramped handwriting that had the particular quality of someone who had learned to write very small so as not to use too much space. "To whoever helps children." The drawing room went very quiet, which was notable because the drawing room was never actually quiet. There was always the creak of the house, the distant thud of thing doing filing in the study, the low moan of the wind through the eaves that sounded like a cello warming up. But somehow it all stepped back, as if the house itself was listening. Morticia opened the letter. It was 4 pages long. The handwriting was small and careful and desperately, heartbreakingly legible, the handwriting of someone who needed to be understood, who could not afford to be misread. It had been written in pencil, not ink, and she understood why when she reached the 2nd page and the pencil lines went shaky and then steadier and then shaky again. Ink would have run. Pencil stayed where you put it. She read it without expression. This was not coldness. Anyone who knew Morticia understood that her stillness in moments of great feeling was like the surface of very deep water. The depth was there, it was simply not performing for anyone. Gomez read over her shoulder, his hand on the small of her back, and she felt him go still too. The letter was from a boy. He did not give his name in full, just H. He wrote very carefully, about 7 years old, although he wasn't completely sure because nobody really talked about his birthday. He lived in a cupboard under the stairs at a house called No. 4, Privet Drive, in a place called Little Whinging, Surrey, England. He had found out, he wrote, from a book he'd read at school during lunch because the library was the one place he was allowed to sit down without being shouted at, that in America there was a family that loved strange things. That loved dark things. That was not afraid of anything. He had read about them in a book that was meant to be scary but which he had found comforting, and he had thought, he wrote this part very slowly, the pencil pressing harder, I thought maybe if there was a family like that they might not mind someone like me. Someone that strange things happen around. Someone the normal people don't like. He had written the letter. He had not known where to send it. So he had written to whoever helps children on the envelope and gone to the woods at the back of the school during lunch, when nobody was watching, and he had put the letter on a tree stump. And then, he wrote this with what Morticia could feel was a very precise and earnest effort not to seem like he was exaggerating, a raven had come and taken it. I know that sounds made up, he wrote at the bottom of the last page. Most things I could tell you sound made up. I'm sorry if this was the wrong thing to do. I just thought if anyone would believe a raven did something helpful it might be you. The letter ended there. No signature. Just the initial, and below it, so small she almost missed it, a single additional line. I'm not asking for much. I just wanted someone to know. Morticia folded the letter. She placed it on the side table. She picked up her pruning shears, which lived on a silver tray next to the good candelabra because she found it practical, and she dead-headed a black rose without looking at it. Gomez, she said, in a tone that made the candles nearest to her burn about half an inch higher. Already thinking about lawyers, he said. I want the best ones. Cara mia, I want the terrifying ones. She turned to look at him, and there was something in her face that wasn't quite a smile. It was what a smile would be if a smile had edges. Then find me both. Gomez Addams laughed, which was a full-body event at the best of times, and clapped his hands together once, and said, Tish, my love, my dark star, my one and only. He kissed her hand again, her knuckles this time. We are going to England. The firm of Grimshaw, Vex and Pale operated out of a building in New York that did not appear on any standard map of the city. It was not hidden, exactly, it was simply the kind of building that most people's eyes slid off of, the way eyes slide off of something they instinctively understand they are not equipped to engage with. It was 7 stories of black granite with windows that reflected nothing, flanked by 2 stone figures that were definitively not gargoyles, and if you suggested they were gargoyles the partners of the firm would look at you with a very specific expression. Gomez had been a client of the firm for 23 years. More relevantly, he had been a friend of the firm for 23 years, which was a different thing entirely and considerably more valuable. He arrived at 9 in the morning, which was very early for him, as he generally found mornings to be a time best spent in pursuit of Morticia, fencing, or both, wearing his chalk-striped suit with the pocket square and carrying a leather portfolio that was, by this point, already alarmingly thick. Evangeline Grimshaw met him at the door herself. This was notable. Evangeline Grimshaw did not generally meet anyone at the door herself. She was 71 years old, 5 feet tall, and moved like something that had decided to take human form on a temporary basis. Her hair was white and pinned with what appeared to be a real bone hatpin. She had argued before the Supreme Court, 2 international tribunals, and at least 1 hearing that did not appear in any public record. She had never, in her career, lost a case she considered worth winning. Gomez, she said, and offered her hand. He kissed it. She allowed this. Evie, he said. I need a full team. For child welfare. England. Both jurisdictions, mundane and the other kind. He said the other kind with the casual ease of a man who had known about magical institutions since he was 11 years old, because of course Gomez Addams had known. Of course. I have documentation incoming from 3 independent sources. I have a letter written by the child himself. I have an address. And I have, he added, pulling out the portfolio, a preliminary list of violations that I compiled last night which currently stands at 63 items and which my wife informs me is not yet complete. Evangeline Grimshaw opened the portfolio and looked at the first page for approximately 4 seconds. We'll need Vex for the wizarding law components, she said. I was hoping you'd say that. And Pale for the criminal proceedings. Even better. She looked up. This is going to make a great deal of noise, Gomez. Evangeline. He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had never once in his life considered that noise was a problem. That is entirely the point. Inside, over coffee that Grimshaw's personal assistant brewed with an intensity that suggested the machine was frightened of her, Gomez laid out what they knew. The address in Surrey. The letter. His own preliminary research, which had been conducted between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. with the focused energy of a man who found Outraged to be tremendously motivating. The boy, it turned out, was not difficult to find once you knew where to look, or rather, once you knew how to look, in the places that standard searches never thought to check. Gomez had contacts in genealogical archives, in certain hospital records offices, in the kind of sub-registries that existed specifically to track cases that had been flagged and then, inexplicably, unflagged. And what he had found, spread across those records like a shadow that had been very carefully made to look like nothing, was a child named Harry James Potter. Son of James Potter and Lily Potter née Evans, both deceased. Orphaned at 15 months old. Placed by order of one Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, a name which, Gomez had noted with professional interest, appeared in 0 official local authority records, 0 social services files, 0 legal guardianship documentation, with 1 Vernon and Petunia Desley of No. 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey, in what could only be described as the most aggressively undocumented child placement in living memory. There was no home study. There was no background check. There was no ongoing welfare monitoring. There was, as far as Gomez and his researchers could determine, not a single official document confirming that the local authorities in Surrey, or indeed anyone in any official capacity, had ever been informed that a 15-month-old child had been left on a doorstep at night. Tatiana Vex, who handled magical law for the firm, arrived at 10:30 with her own briefcase and the expression of someone who had been briefed by telephone and was quietly furious about it. She was 45, mixed race, and wore robes that managed to look like a power suit and vice versa depending on the light, which Gomez privately thought was extremely efficient. She had trained in both mundane law and at the Wizarding Legal Institute in Edinburgh, and her particular specialty was the intersection of the two, the increasingly complicated legal terrain where magical governance crashed into Muggle jurisdiction and one of them had to blink. The Wizarding Wireless has had whispers about Dumbledore and the Potter placement for years, she said, sitting down and opening her briefcase with a precision that suggested the briefcase knew better than to be difficult. Nothing actionable. Nothing documented. But there's a current, Gomez. People in the magical community who are uncomfortable and who have been uncomfortable for a long time, and who have not had anyone willing to pull the thread. She looked at him. You're going to pull the thread. Tish and I are going to pull the thread, he corrected, and there was warmth in it. Tatiana Vex allowed the corner of her mouth to do something that was not quite a smile. The Ministry is going to fight this. Dumbledore has significant institutional capital. He has political relationships that go very deep. Lovely, said Gomez. I'm describing an obstacle. I know. It sounded wonderful, didn't it? He leaned forward. Tatiana. My wife read that letter last night. By the time she was finished she had filled an entire page of our best notepaper with notes in her finest handwriting, which I want you to understand is both extremely elegant and deeply efficient. She has not slept. She is currently in our London hotel suite reading every piece of documentation I had sent over and she has not stopped since we landed at 6 this morning. He paused. When Morticia Addams does not sleep because she is too angry, I promise you, whatever the Ministry has, it will not be enough. The room was quiet for a moment. Get me England by tomorrow, Tatiana said finally, and picked up her phone. Augustus Pale arrived last, at noon, and he was exactly as advertised. He was, in no particular order, 6 feet 4 inches tall, thin in the way of very old buildings that have decided to remain standing purely through stubbornness, the possessor of a law degree from Oxford, a second law degree from Harvard, a third qualification from an institution that he declined to name, a 40-year career in criminal and civil rights litigation, and a professional reputation that preceded him into rooms like weather precedes a storm. He was 78 and had the energy of a man who had simply decided not to accommodate the passage of time. He wore black. He carried a briefcase that was older than most of the people in the building. He had, over the course of his career, put 4 government officials in prison, successfully sued 3 separate law enforcement agencies, and argued before the European Court of Human Rights on 8 separate occasions, winning 6 and losing 2 in ways that had changed the law anyway. He looked at the portfolio. He looked at Gomez. He looked at the preliminary violation list. 63 items, Gomez said. And climbing, Pale noted, reading. My wife is at 68 as of this morning. Pale turned a page. The cupboard. Yes. How long? We believe since age 4 or 5. Possibly earlier. We're still pulling records. Pale set the portfolio down. He was quiet for a moment in the way that very controlled people are quiet when they are deciding something fundamental. I want to be in the room when we serve the Dursleys, he said. I was rather hoping you'd say that, Gomez said, and for the second time that morning, smiled. By the time Gomez returned to their London hotel suite at 2 in the afternoon, Morticia had moved the furniture. This was not unusual. Morticia had a habit, when working intensely on something, of rearranging whatever space she was in so that it better suited her thinking. The hotel room, a good one, high ceilings, dark wood, the kind of establishment that had been operating since the Victorian era and showed it, had been transformed. The desk had been moved to face the window. The lamps had been repositioned and 3 of the bulbs removed so the light was lower and more directional. The bedside tables had been pushed together to form a secondary work surface. The television remote had been put in a drawer. Morticia was standing at the main desk in front of a spread of papers that covered every surface, and she was wearing the floor-length black dress with the sleeves and the neckline that Gomez privately considered one of the great masterworks of human civilization. Her hair was up, which meant she was working. Her reading glasses were on, the narrow dark-framed ones she refused to wear around anyone except Gomez and occasionally Wednesday, on the grounds that she considered them a concession to time and she was not yet prepared to make concessions, and she was writing. She didn't look up. 71, she said. The list is at 71. I found 3 more in the medical records and 1 in the school attendance documentation that I think we can argue as a direct violation of his right to adequate nutrition, because the teacher's notes from his first year indicate he frequently fell asleep in class in the morning, which combined with the physical assessment data, Tish. He was beside her now, and he put his hands on her shoulders, and she paused. How are you? She was quiet for a moment. I am, she said, with great precision, furious. I know, cara mia. He wrote that letter on a tree stump, Gomez. He put it on a tree stump and hoped a raven would take it because he had no other options and he had read about us in a library book. She set down her pen. He's been in that house for 6 years. 6 years of, she gestured at the papers, which was all the gesture needed, because the papers were 71 violations and counting. And apparently the entirety of the wizarding establishment decided that this was an acceptable arrangement because a very old man said so. Not for much longer. No. She picked up her pen again. I want everything ready for the morning. I want to be at that address at 9 a.m. The team will be assembled tonight. Evangeline, Tatiana, Augustus, they're all in London by 6. Good. She paused, and then she said, in a slightly different voice, quieter, and underneath the fury there was something else, something that had more softness in it, Gomez. In the letter. He says I'm not asking for much, I just wanted someone to know. I remember. He undersells himself, she said. Children always do, when they've been told they take up too much space. He was asking for everything. He simply didn't believe he was allowed. She looked at the papers. He is going to know that someone knows. Several someones. In the most legally comprehensive and professionally terrifying manner possible. Gomez kissed the top of her head. Magnificently put. We should also bring him something, she said, returning to her notes with a focus that brooked no further interruption. When we meet him. Something from the house. He'll be frightened. I'll ask Wednesday to choose something. She has a talent for it. Wednesday is coming? She called this morning. She said she had additional documentation she felt was relevant and that she wasn't going to miss it. For the first time in several hours, Morticia's lips curved. Of course she is. That evening, the team assembled in the hotel's private dining room, an arrangement that Gomez had made by the simple expedient of booking the entire room and then making it clear to the hotel staff that they were welcome to bring food but not to linger. This was delivered so pleasantly that the staff felt, afterwards, that they had thought of it themselves. Evangeline Grimshaw sat at one end of the table with 3 associates who had the look of people who had passed the bar and then continued accelerating. Tatiana Vex had spread her wizarding law documents across half the table surface and was annotating them in a purple ink that seemed to do something slightly odd in the candlelight. Augustus Pale sat very still and read, which he had been doing continuously since noon and showed no signs of stopping. Gomez was at the head of the table, because he always was, not because anyone sat him there but because rooms tended to orient around him the way sunflowers orient around light. Morticia sat beside him and the table was, in aggregate, quite glad she had agreed to attend. 74, Morticia said, when the food had come and the staff had gone. I found 3 more in the afternoon. She passed the updated list to Pale, who received it without expression. I'd like to walk through the categories, he said. Please. Physical welfare violations. He had a voice like very old wood, dark, solid, something that had been tested by time. Inadequate living conditions, to wit, a child confined to an understair cupboard as primary sleeping quarters for a period of not less than 5 years, we're estimating 6, Tatiana interrupted. Wizarding child welfare records suggest he was moved there very shortly after placement. Pale nodded. 6. No natural light in said sleeping quarters. No adequate ventilation. Substandard bedding documented in school nurse records from his first year, which noted bruising consistent with sleeping on a hard surface. He looked up. The school nurse flagged it. Flagged it to whom? Grimshaw asked. That's the question. We're still tracing the paperwork. My current working theory is that it went exactly nowhere. Nutrition, said one of Grimshaw's associates, a young woman named Chen who had the quality of someone who was going to be extremely important in about 15 years and was already aware of it. We have 8 specific incidents documented in school records where teachers noted the child appeared underfed. 3 instances of fainting. The school lunch records show a pattern of the child eating much larger portions than his classmates, consistent with inadequate home nutrition. Clothing, said the second associate, a tall man named Okafor who handled evidentiary documentation. Multiple teacher reports noting clothing that was not weather appropriate, significantly oversized, and in a state of repair inconsistent with the family's evident income level, given that the cousin was consistently and expensively dressed. The comparison is important, Morticia said. The differential treatment. It's not poverty. It's selection. Exactly, said Grimshaw. Which moves us from neglect toward deliberate deprivation, which is a meaningfully different legal category. Then there's the magical component, Tatiana said, and the table shifted slightly in register, because everyone here knew about the magical world. It would have been impossible to do this work without that knowledge, but its explicit invocation still had a particular weight. Harry Potter is a wizard. His mother was a witch. His father was a wizard. His placement with a Muggle family is not inherently improper. The blood protection charm is a real piece of magic with real measurable effects, but the manner and conditions of that placement absolutely are. She tapped her notes. I have located the original text of the so-called Privet Drive arrangement, which is what it's referred to in internal ministry correspondence, and it is, she paused, and her expression did something very controlled, it is not a formal legal instrument. It is a memo. A single memo from Albus Dumbledore to then-Minister for Magic Millicent Bagnold, describing his intention to place the child and the rationale. It was not reviewed. It was not challenged. It was filed and, I believe, forgotten, in the comfortable assumption that Albus Dumbledore did not make mistakes. Remarkable, said Gomez, who did not sound surprised so much as delighted by the scale of the negligence. "There's no guardianship instrument in wizarding law," Tatiana continued. "Nothing that formally establishes the Dursleys as Harry Potter's legal guardians in a wizarding context. They have de facto custody but no de jure authority. Which means the original placement was never properly constituted," Pale said, and for a moment he and Tatiana looked at each other with the particular warmth of two lawyers who have just found a very large weapon. "Which means," Tatiana agreed, "that everything that follows from that placement is on extraordinarily shaky ground." The candles burned. Outside, London made its London sounds, all traffic and rain and old stone. "I want to be very clear," Morticia said, and everyone at the table became very attentive, because Morticia's voice had shifted into something that had no edges at all, which was somehow more commanding than when it had them. "Our primary obligation tomorrow is to that child. Every legal instrument, every piece of documentation, every procedural motion, it is all in service of one thing. He wrote a letter asking to be known. We are going to make very certain that the people responsible for his suffering are known instead." There was a silence. "The other thing," she said, "is that when we arrive at that house, we go in as what we are. We do not soften. We do not minimize. We do not perform approachability for the comfort of the Dursleys or their neighbors." She looked around the table. "We are the most frightening legal team in 2 jurisdictions on behalf of a child who has been systematically treated as though he does not matter. I would like them to feel that." Evangeline Grimshaw touched the bone hatpin in her hair. "Morticia," she said, "I have never felt better about a case in my life." Wednesday Addams arrived on the 11 p.m. train from Edinburgh, where she had been conducting what she described, over the phone to Gomez, as supplementary research, and what was, in practice, a one-woman forensic archive dive into every record the Wizarding Legal Institute held pertaining to the Potter placement and its aftermath. She was 16. She carried a black leather satchel that was dangerously full, a crossbow that she had somehow gotten through 3 separate transportation checkpoints, and the expression she always wore, which was the expression of someone who has assessed the situation and found it wanting. Gomez met her in the hotel lobby. "You brought the crossbow," he said. "I brought evidence," she said. "The crossbow is a separate matter." "What did you find?" Wednesday set her satchel on the lobby's side table and opened it, and what emerged was a quantity of papers that suggested she had not slept on the train. Internal Ministry correspondence from 1981 through 1986. There were 3 separate welfare inquiries initiated by lower-level ministry officials who felt the Potter placement warranted review. All 3 were closed before they resulted in any formal action. In each case, the closure was authorized by the same office, the office of the chief warlock of the Wizengamot. Gomez looked at her. "Dumbledore," Wednesday said, "not as revelation but as confirmation. He closed 3 inquiries. He closed 3 inquiries, and in the 3rd closure document, which I found in an archive subfolder that was labeled, and I want you to appreciate this, Miscellaneous Historical Correspondence 1985, he wrote, in his own handwriting, that the placement was essential to the protection of the wizarding world as a whole, and that the temporary discomforts of the child's domestic situation must be weighed against the catastrophic alternative. Those are his exact words. Temporary discomforts. The lobby of the hotel was very quiet at 11 p.m. A night porter moved somewhere in the background. The chandelier above them turned slightly in an unfelt breeze. "Does your mother know?" Wednesday asked. "I'll tell her in the morning," Gomez said. "She needs to sleep." Wednesday looked at him with an expression that suggested she thought the probability of Morticia sleeping was quite low. "I mean," Gomez said, "she needs to have the opportunity to choose not to sleep." "I also found," Wednesday said, reaching back into the satchel, "the school records for the cousin. Dudley Dursley. Cross-referenced with Harry's. The differential is," she handed him the paper, "systematic. Consistent. Documented across 6 years of academic records." Gomez looked at the comparative records. His jaw tightened, briefly, in the way it only did when he felt something he could not immediately channel into action. 74 violations, he said. I can add 4 more, said Wednesday, and produced another sheet. He looked at it. 78, he said. I think there are more in the medical records. I didn't have access to those in Edinburgh. Augustus has them. Then we'll be at 80 by morning. She said it the way another person might have said the weather looks fine, which was to say entirely without effect and entirely accurately. Gomez put his arm around her shoulders. She allowed this with the dignity of someone granting a significant concession. You did well, he said. I know, she said. Can I have the room next to the one with the gargoyle? There's no gargoyle. There's a stone figure outside the window of room 412 that is not a gargoyle but that is extremely interesting company. How do you know about room 412? I walked past it when I arrived. She picked up her satchel. The crossbow is for the ministry, by the way. Not literally. It's a metaphor. Of course, said Gomez. Mostly, said Wednesday, and went to find the lift. At midnight, in the hotel room, Morticia was still at the desk. She had removed her reading glasses and was looking at the window, at the London night pressing against the glass, and she was thinking about a boy in a cupboard who had learned to write small so as not to use too much space, and who had put a letter on a tree stump in the woods and called for help in the only language he thought might reach someone. Gomez came in, took off his jacket, loosened his tie, and came to stand behind her, his hands on her shoulders again. Wednesday's here, he said. 78 violations. Possibly 80 by morning. Morticia nodded. Dumbledore closed 3 welfare inquiries, he said. I'll tell you the details tomorrow. You should rest. She said nothing for a moment. Gomez, she said finally. We will not be afraid of him. Cara mia, he said, we have never been afraid of anything. She reached up and put her hand over his. Good, she said. Because tomorrow we are going to Privet Drive, and I want them to remember it for the rest of their lives. Outside, London rained. The papers rustled softly in the dark, 78 reasons and climbing, and in the morning a convoy of the most magnificently terrifying legal minds in 2 worlds was going to drive to a very ordinary street in Surrey and knock on a door. The Dursleys were still asleep. They had no idea. They would remember waking up tomorrow for the rest of their lives. Chapter 2, Number 4. The convoy assembled at 8:15 in the hotel car park, and it was not the kind of convoy that Privet Drive had ever seen before, nor the kind it had been designed to accommodate. There were 3 cars. The first was a black Bentley of indeterminate vintage that looked like it had been built in an era when automobiles were still considered a bold experiment, and which ran with an absolute silence that was slightly unnerving. Gomez drove it, because Gomez always drove, and because he approached driving the way he approached fencing, with complete commitment and a cheerful disregard for the anxieties of passengers. Morticia sat beside him in the front. In the back, Augustus Pale read documents and Tatiana Vex made notes in her peculiar purple ink. The second car was a gunmetal grey Range Rover, new and aggressively functional, carrying Evangeline Grimshaw and her 3 associates, Chen, Okafor, and a third associate named Marsh who specialized in documentation and had spent the last 18 hours doing nothing else. They had 4 cases of files between them and a portable printer that Okafor was still not quite finished with. The third car was a black cab that Wednesday had arranged independently, because Wednesday had her own itinerary for the morning, which included a stop at a records office in Guildford that she had not mentioned to anyone yet. Wednesday is taking a detour, Gomez told Morticia as he pulled out of the car park. I know, Morticia said. She texted me at 5 a.m. Did she sleep? She said she sat with the stone figure and found it restful. Gomez nodded. This was entirely acceptable. The drive from London to Little Whinging took just under an hour, during which Pale read 62 pages of medical documentation, Tatiana revised her approach to the wizarding law citation 6 times, and Gomez drove with one hand on the wheel and told Morticia 3 separate stories about the last time a legal opponent had tried to argue structural necessity against him. All 3 stories ending with the legal opponent losing very thoroughly and Gomez finding the experience tremendously satisfying. Morticia listened and made occasional interjections that were precise and devastating, which was the normal rhythm of their collaboration and which Pale and Vex had learned to appreciate rather than find unsettling. The motorway gave way to the A-roads, and the A-roads gave way to the roundabouts, and the roundabouts gave way to residential streets, and the residential streets gave way, with a kind of slow inevitability, like a bad joke arriving at its punchline, to Privet Drive. Morticia looked at it through the windscreen. It was, in the way of things that are making a very determined effort, incredibly ordinary. The houses were identical in the way that speaks not to coincidence but to intention. Someone had wanted this uniformity, had chosen it, had tended it. The gardens were immaculate. The driveways held sensible cars. The curtains in every window were pulled back to exactly the same angle, as if there had been a meeting about it. It was the kind of street that had been designed by someone who believed very deeply that the visible absence of difference was the same thing as the presence of safety. Extraordinary, Morticia said quietly, and there was something in her tone that was not admiration. It's like a film set, Pale observed from the back. It's like a warning, Morticia said. Gomez pulled up outside number 4. The Bentley sat at the curb with the serenity of something that knew it didn't belong here and had decided that was the other street's problem. The Range Rover pulled in behind it. The effect of the 2 vehicles on Privet Drive was immediate. Net curtains moved at number 6, and number 2, and number 8. A woman walking a very small dog on the opposite pavement stopped and stared. Gomez stepped out of the Bentley, buttoned his jacket, and looked at the house. Number 4, Privet Drive, was a perfectly maintained semi-detached with a yellow door and a bed of marigolds and not a single thing visibly wrong with it. Which was, of course, precisely the point. Morticia emerged from the passenger side and stood on the pavement, and the woman with the small dog stared harder, because Morticia was not the kind of person Privet Drive had planned for. The floor-length black dress. The perfect posture. The quality of absolute composure that she wore like a second skin. The small dog made a sound that was not quite a bark and pressed itself against its owner's legs. "Ready?" Gomez said. Morticia looked at the yellow door. "I've been ready since Tuesday," she said. The team assembled on the pavement with the efficient, practiced ease of people who had done this before in various configurations. Grimshaw fell in on Morticia's right, because Grimshaw understood positioning. Pale was already holding his briefcase in the way a surgeon holds an instrument before an operation. Tatiana Vex had her own briefcase and an expression that was professionally neutral in a way that took years to perfect. Chen, Okafor, and Marsh arranged themselves slightly behind the primary line with the case files. They walked up the garden path. Gomez knocked on the door. Vernon Dursley opened it in his dressing gown, because it was 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning and nobody knocked on doors at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning in Privet Drive, and he had therefore not been prepared. He was a large man, red-faced, with a mustache that had strong opinions. He had the quality of someone who was accustomed to being the largest presence in any room he entered, and who used this as a kind of social architecture. His eyes went to Gomez first, the chalk-striped suit, the slicked hair, the sheer theatrical self-confidence of him, and then to Morticia, and then, with increasing discomfort, to the assembled team on his garden path, and then back to Gomez. "Can I help you?" he said, in the voice of a man who is already deciding the answer is no. "Vernon Dursley?" Gomez said, pleasantly. "Yes, wonderful. Gomez Addams." He produced a card and held it out. It was a very good card, cream stock, black ink, the kind of weight that tells you immediately that the person who ordered it was not uncertain about themselves. Vernon took it by reflex. "My wife, Morticia. Our colleagues, Grimshaw, Pale, Vex, and Associates." He gestured along the line the way a conductor gestures at an orchestra. "We're here regarding the welfare of your nephew, Harry Potter. May we come in?" Vernon's face did a number of things in quick succession. The redness deepened. The mustache twitched. His eyes went again to Morticia, who was watching him with the specific stillness of something that has decided to let the moment develop at its own pace. Then to the team behind her. Then to the car at the curb, which even Vernon could identify as a vehicle that cost more than his house. "I don't know what this is about," he said, "but whatever it is, we have documentation," Morticia said. It was the first thing she'd said since the door opened, and something about the way she said it made Vernon stop mid-sentence. She said it the way people state facts of physics. Without argument or invitation for debate. Extensive documentation. "We also have legal authority in both jurisdictions relevant to this matter. We would prefer to conduct this conversation inside, Mr. Dursley, but we are entirely willing to conduct it on the doorstep." She glanced, briefly and pointedly, at the net curtains of number 6, which were definitely moving. "The choice is yours." Vernon Dursley had lived his entire adult life inside the armor of respectability. The glance at the curtains was a stiletto between the plates. He stepped back from the door. The interior of number 4 was exactly what the exterior suggested, aggressively normal, expensively tidy, every surface holding exactly the right objects in exactly the right arrangement. Family photos on the hallway wall. A large boy beaming out of every one of them, draped in birthday banners, surrounded by presents, eating cake. Gomez noted the photos as he came in. Morticia noted them. Neither said anything. What there was not, in any of the photos, was a smaller, darker-haired boy. This was noted too. Petunia Dursley appeared at the top of the stairs in a housecoat, her neck craning, her face already tight with the particular anxiety of someone who had been waiting for something like this for years and had spent those years trying to convince themselves it wasn't coming. She was thin, with a horse-like quality to her features that spoke to a lifetime of stretching to see over other people's fences. She took in Morticia with an expression that moved through several emotions very quickly, surprise, something almost like recognition, and then a hardening that was defensive and automatic. "Who are," she started. "Petunia Dursley," Morticia said, looking up at her with no particular urgency. "Please come down. This involves you equally." Petunia came down the stairs. She came down them the way she did everything, Gomez thought, looking for an exit while pretending she wasn't. They settled in the sitting room, which was a negotiation unto itself, because the sitting room of number 4 had not been designed to hold 9 people plus a legal crisis, and the Addams contingent filled it with a quality of presence that made the floral sofa cushions and the cream carpet look faintly apologetic. Vernon sat on the sofa with his arms crossed. Petunia perched beside him, not quite touching him. Gomez settled into the armchair across from them with the ease of a man completely comfortable in every room he has ever entered. Morticia did not sit. She stood beside the fireplace, which was not lit, and looked at the room with an expression of complete clarity. The rest of the team distributed themselves with professional efficiency, Pale near the door with a document case now open across his knees, Grimshaw and Chen on the dining chairs that had been brought through, Tatiana standing near the window with her own papers. "Where is Harry?" Morticia asked. "He's upstairs," Petunia said. "In his room?" A beat of silence. "Yes." "Which room?" Another beat, slightly longer. The small room. At the top of the stairs." Morticia looked at her for a moment with an expression that was perfectly composed and absolutely legible. Then she looked at Gomez. "I'll go," said Okafor, quietly. He looked at Vernon. "With your permission, Mr. Dursley, or, if you'd prefer, I can note that you refused access to the child, which will appear in today's documentation." He said it without any heat at all, the way you say the meeting starts at 9 or take the second left. Vernon's arms tightened across his chest. "Fine," he said. Okafor went upstairs. The sitting room held itself in a particular silence while he was gone. Vernon Dursley looked at Gomez with the expression of a man trying to establish dominance over a situation he did not yet understand. Gomez looked back at him with the expression of a man who is enjoying himself enormously and is comfortable with however long this takes. "Now see here," Vernon said. "I don't know who you people are, or what you think you're. We've served notice," Grimshaw said, producing an envelope and setting it on the coffee table between them. "By hand, as you can see. This is the formal notification of a welfare assessment under Section 47 of the Children Act 1989, as well as a parallel notification under the relevant provisions of the International Statute of Wizarding Welfare, 1980 revision. You don't need to understand both of those instruments today. Your solicitor can explain them to you." She paused. "I would recommend engaging a solicitor." "I have rights, you do," Pale said, from near the door, not looking up from his documents. "We have documented them thoroughly. We have also documented the rights of your nephew, Mr. Dursley, and I can assure you the second list is considerably longer than you might expect." "There is nothing wrong in this house," Vernon said, and he said it with such volume and conviction that Petunia flinched slightly, a movement so small and so practiced that it was almost invisible. Morticia saw it. She said nothing. She simply turned her head and looked at the wall beside the fireplace, where the family photos ended and the wallpaper was uninterrupted. Then she looked at the door to the hallway, which was open, and through it, at the angle of the wall just beneath the stairs. "The cupboard," she said. Petunia's hands went still in her lap. "Under the stairs," Morticia said. "May I look at it?" "There's nothing," Vernon started. "Mr. Dursley." Morticia turned to look at him, and there was something in the quality of her attention that was very different from the passive act it appeared to be. It was focused. It was complete. It had the quality of light through a lens, gathered, directed, and capable of heat. "I am going to look at the cupboard under your stairs. The question is simply whether it happens now, with your cooperation, or whether it happens in 20 minutes with a court order, in which case the documentation will note your initial refusal. I am giving you the opportunity to choose the former because I believe in providing opportunities." She held his gaze for exactly one more second. "The opportunity will not be extended." Vernon looked at her. He looked at Gomez, who was watching him with a mild, pleasant expression and said nothing, because Gomez understood perfectly that Morticia needed nothing from him right now except witness. "Fine," Vernon said, for the second time. The word was getting smaller each time he used it. The cupboard under the stairs at number 4, Privet Drive, was 3 feet wide and 6 feet deep, with a sloped ceiling that made the far end, where the sleeping area was, approximately 4 feet high at its tallest point. There was a cot mattress on the floor. There was a single blanket. There was a shelf that held a broken toy soldier, 3 crayons, and a small stack of library books. There was a hook on the back of the door where a coat could hang. There was no window. There was no ventilation beyond the gap under the door. There was a lock on the outside. Morticia opened the door and looked at it for a long time. Chen was behind her with a camera, documenting everything. Marsh had a measurements device. They worked with professional, quiet efficiency, but there was something in the quality of their silence that was not professional detachment. It was more like the silence of people who are very carefully not allowing themselves to react until the work is done. The walls inside the cupboard, at roughly hand height, had pencil marks on them. Small ones. An H, scratched very carefully. A series of marks that might have been counting. A drawing of what might have been an owl, with wide eyes and careful wings. Morticia reached out and touched the owl drawing, lightly, with one finger. She did not say anything. She turned and walked back to the sitting room, and as she passed through the hallway she passed Okafor, who had come downstairs, and behind him, hesitant on the 3rd stair from the bottom, watching everything with green eyes that were enormous behind round glasses, was a small boy with dark hair and a scar on his forehead. He was 8 years old. He was wearing a t-shirt that was 4 sizes too large for him and trousers held up with what appeared to be a piece of rope. He was thin in a way that was not the natural thinness of childhood. He had the posture of someone who had learned very carefully to take up exactly as little space as possible, and his eyes moved across the hallway with the quick, assessing quality of someone who was always watching for whatever was about to go wrong. He looked at Morticia. Morticia looked at him. And then, because she was Morticia Addams and she was not uncertain about what this moment required, she crossed the hallway to the foot of the stairs and she looked up at him and she said, in her normal voice, not softened or raised or adjusted in any of the ways adults usually adjusted their voices for children they felt sorry for, because she did not feel sorry for him, she felt furious on his behalf, which is a completely different thing. You must be Harry. The boy's mouth opened slightly. He looked like he had been braced for something entirely different. Yes, he said, very carefully. I'm Morticia Addams. My husband Gomez is in the sitting room. She held his gaze steadily. Do you know why we're here? A long pause. The green eyes moved to the door of the sitting room, where he could presumably hear his uncle's raised voice, now directed at Augustus Pale, who was receiving it with the tranquility of a mountain receiving weather. Then back to Morticia. Something went wrong, he said. Yes, Morticia said. Something went very wrong. We're here to fix it. She paused. Are you frightened? Harry considered this question with the seriousness of someone who understood that it was a real question requiring a real answer. A bit, he said. That's sensible, Morticia said. You don't know us. Would it help to know that we find this house far more frightening than you should find us? He blinked. And then, cautiously, experimentally, like something trying out a movement it wasn't sure its body knew, he almost smiled. Come into the sitting room, Morticia said, and turned toward it, and he came, because she had spoken to him like a person who expected to be followed, not because she was trying to drag him somewhere. Harry Potter's entrance into the sitting room changed its geometry. Vernon Dursley went red in a way that was new and more specific, not the anger red of before, but something more like alarm. Petunia made a sound in her throat and looked away, which told Morticia a great deal. And Harry himself stopped just inside the doorway and looked at the assembled room, the lawyers, the documents, Gomez in his armchair, all of it, with eyes that were doing a tremendous amount of work. Gomez looked at Harry. Harry looked at Gomez. Gomez leaned forward slightly in the armchair and said, with complete sincerity, "Splendid to meet you. I've heard very good things." Harry's brow furrowed. About me? Entirely about you. Sit down, there's a chair there, next to the door, and you can leave whenever you like. I want you to know that. You're not required to be here. But we'd like you to stay if you're willing. Harry looked at the chair. He looked at the door. He sat in the chair but positioned himself so the door was accessible, and Gomez noted this without comment and felt the particular quality of furious grief that he had been carrying since Tuesday. The sitting room rearranged itself around this new configuration. Grimshaw produced the document they had been building toward, a thick sheaf of papers, clipped and tabbed, which she placed on the coffee table facing the Dursleys. On its cover page, in large clear type, were the words, "Formal documentation of child welfare violations, the matter of Harry James Potter, aged 8. Vernon stared at it. "We'll work through these in order," Grimshaw said, with the brisk efficiency of someone who has done this before and intends to do it well. There are currently 74 items documented. Our colleague is still completing her review, so this number may increase. She opened the first tab. Violation 1. Inadequate sleeping conditions. The child was confined to an under-stair cupboard as his primary sleeping quarters. Now listen here, Vernon started. Mr. Dursley, Pale said, and his voice was very quiet, which made it carry the way quiet things do in small rooms. You will have the opportunity to respond at the appropriate stage. Right now, I'd ask you to listen. You are going to want to have heard all of this before you decide how you would like to proceed. Vernon closed his mouth. The look on his face was the look of a man meeting a wall for the first time. Grimshaw continued. She read for 40 minutes. She read clearly and without emphasis, which was in some ways worse than if she had been theatrical about it, because the absence of drama made each item feel like a stone being placed rather than thrown. Each violation had its number, its description, its evidentiary source. Photographs. Medical records. School attendance documents. Teacher notes. The comparative analysis of Dudley's clothing records against Harry's. Harry sat in the chair by the door and listened. Morticia watched him. She watched him hear his life being documented, item by item, and she watched what happened to his face, which was very controlled, the face of someone who had learned not to show much, but which, at certain items, did things it could not entirely help. When Grimshaw read the school nurse's notes about the bruising. When she described the nutrition differential. When she read the entry about Harry's birthday, specifically, the absence of any record of it ever being acknowledged, in 6 years of school records, through any card, party, or notation, something crossed Harry's face very quickly and was then carefully removed. Petunia Dursley sat very still and looked at the carpet. This was its own kind of documentation. Vernon, as the reading went on, went through several stages. The initial bluster gradually dried up, not because he was convinced but because the sheer accumulative weight of the documentation was doing something to him that shouting couldn't fix. By violation 30, he was still red but had gone quiet. By violation 50, he had developed a quality of stillness that was not the stillness of acceptance but the stillness of a large animal that realizes it has walked into an enclosure. Violation 61, Grimshaw continued. Systematic exclusion from family events, documented through school records in which the child lists family activities, specifically birthday parties, Christmas gatherings, and summer holidays, as events from which he was absent, while his cousin describes participation in all of the same. This pattern is consistent across 6 years of records. Harry looked at the floor. Just briefly. Then looked back up. Violation 62, Grimshaw said. The external lock on the sleeping quarters as described in Violation 1, documented photographically by our associate this morning. The lock is functional and positioned to secure the cupboard from the outside. This one landed differently. Vernon shifted. Petunia's hands tightened in her lap. Violation 63, stop, Petunia said. Everyone in the room looked at her. She was not looking at any of them. She was looking at her own hands in her lap. Her voice had the quality of something that had been held down for a long time and had finally found an opening. Petunia, Vernon said. I said stop. Her voice was steady. Let her finish. Silence. Violation 63, Grimshaw continued, after a moment. Physical evidence of malnutrition confirmed by independent medical review of available records, indicating a sustained pattern of nutritional deprivation inconsistent with the family's income level, consistent with deliberate rationing. Petunia was still looking at her hands. Grimshaw finished at 74. She placed the document on the coffee table. The room was very quiet. It was Gomez who spoke next. He had been silent through the entire reading, which for Gomez was a considerable act of discipline. He set down the coffee cup he'd been holding. He'd asked for coffee when they arrived and had been given it, because even the Dursleys' paralysis had manners, and he looked at Vernon. Mr. Dursley, he said pleasantly. I'm going to tell you what happens next, so that you have the full picture. In approximately 48 hours, an application will be filed in the family division of the High Court seeking emergency removal of Harry from this household. Parallel proceedings will be initiated in the Wizarding Magistracy, which I appreciate you may not be familiar with, but which has jurisdiction here and which has been significantly overdue in exercising it. He smiled, which was warm and unhurried and about as comforting as a lit fuse. Now, those proceedings are going to happen. That is not something that is available for negotiation. What is available for negotiation is how they happen, specifically, whether they happen with your cooperation, which will be noted and weighted, or without it. Vernon looked at him. You can't just walk into someone's house and, we did, though, Gomez pointed out. You invited us in. Vernon stopped. You stepped back from the door, Gomez said, still pleasantly. That constitutes invitation. It's been held up in about 14 different courts. Augustus, is that right? 16, Pale said, from near the door. 16 courts. Good. So. Gomez stood, and even the act of standing was somehow expansive, like the room readjusted to fit him better when he was upright. He buttoned his jacket. You'll want to call a solicitor. I'd recommend doing that today. Grimshaw's firm can provide a list of appropriate contacts if you don't have one, yes? We can, Grimshaw said. Excellent. Harry, he turned to Harry, who was still in the chair by the door, still and watchful, could you come here for a moment? Harry looked at Vernon. He looked at Morticia. He stood up and came forward, with the careful movement of someone navigating a field they know to be mined. Gomez crouched down so that he was at Harry's level, which on Gomez took some doing but which he accomplished without any awkwardness. He looked at Harry directly. We're going to sort this out, he said. I want you to know that. Whatever happens in the next few days, and some of it is going to be loud, I'm warning you now, none of the loud parts are aimed at you. All right? Harry looked at him. What's going to happen to me? We're working on the best possible answer to that question. Gomez's voice did not soften into false comfort. It stayed level, honest, adult. What I can tell you right now is that you're not going to stay in that cupboard another night. Something happened on Harry's face. It was extremely brief and quickly controlled, but Morticia caught it from across the room, and what it was not relief exactly, it was more like the thing that comes before relief, the moment of collision between what you've been holding and what you've just been told, before the body knows whether it's allowed to put the weight down. Okay, Harry said, very quietly. Good man, Gomez said, and straightened up. Morticia had been watching the room, and specifically watching the corner of it, for the last several minutes. There was a door in the far corner that had been closed when they arrived. It was still closed. But at some point in the last 40 minutes, while Grimshaw was reading, the handle had moved. How old is Dudley? She asked Petunia. Petunia looked up. He's 8. Same age as Harry. Is he behind that door? A pause. He came down for breakfast and I told him to stay out of the way, Morticia said. Not accusing. Noting. Petunia looked at the door. There was something in her face that was more complex than Morticia had expected, not quite guilt, but the close relative of it that lives next door to guilt and borrows its expressions. She was a woman, Morticia thought, who had made a choice 6 years ago and had been living with it in a particular way, not ignoring it, exactly, but keeping it in a specific room in her mind and not going near the door. The door to the kitchen opened. Dudley Dursley appeared in it, large, blonde, pink-faced, wearing Spider-Man pajamas and holding a box of cereal he'd apparently been eating from directly. He looked at the room full of strangers. He looked at his father. He looked at Harry, and then away from Harry with a speed that was its own kind of information. Dudley, Vernon said immediately, in the tone adults use to remove children from difficult situations. Go back upstairs. Dudley looked at Harry again. Harry was looking at the floor. Dudley went back upstairs without saying anything, but he went slowly, and he looked back once from the doorway, and his expression was not the expression of a child who has been simply told to leave. It was the expression of a child who had been listening at doors for a while. Morticia filed this away. The formal phase of the visit concluded at 11:30. The Dursleys had been served. The documentation had been delivered in triplicate. Pale had explained the legal timeline with a thoroughness that left no room for the fiction that this was something that might go away, and Grimshaw had provided 3 solicitor referrals on a card and the pointed observation that they had until Monday morning to confirm their cooperation. Tatiana had served the parallel wizarding notification, a document on paper that had a particular quality to it, heavy and with an iridescent shimmer at the edges, that Vernon had stared at with the expression of a man whose worldview had recently developed significant structural problems. The team prepared to leave. Documents were gathered. Cases were closed. Harry stood in the hallway and watched them preparing to go, and his face did not show what it was doing in this moment, but Morticia was watching him and she knew what it was doing. He was recalculating. He had heard 74 violations. He had heard his life itemized and acknowledged and set on a table. He had heard someone say, "You're not going to sleep in that cupboard tonight." And now the people who had said those things were preparing to leave, and he was standing in the hallway of number 4, and the old arithmetic of his life was warring with something new that didn't have a name yet. Morticia stopped beside him. She reached into the small bag she carried, which was black and had a clasp shaped like a small skull, and she took out a card. It was the card for Grimshaw, Vex and Pale. On the back, she had written a number in her precise handwriting. "This is my personal telephone number," she said. "If anything happens that you need to tell someone about, you can call it. Any time." She held his gaze. "Any time, Harry." He took the card. He looked at it for a moment, and then he looked up at her, and this time the something on his face was less controlled and less brief. It was a child who had been handed a rope and was trying to figure out if it was going to hold. "You'll come back," he said. "We will be back with court documents by Monday," she said. "That is a legal and logistical certainty." She paused. "We will also be back because we said we would. Which is a different kind of certainty, but in my experience the more reliable one." Harry held the card carefully, as if it might be taken from him. "Your letter reached us," Morticia said quietly. "I want you to know that. You put it on the tree stump and it reached us." He looked at her. "It was a very good letter," she said. His throat moved. He nodded once, very small. She turned and walked out the door. On the garden path, Gomez fell into step beside her, and she took his arm, and they walked back to the Bentley through the morning sunshine of Privet Drive, which was very ordinary and smelled of freshly cut grass and someone's washing machine. Behind them, the yellow door of number 4 was still open. Pale was the last one out, as he had been the last one in, and as he passed through the door he glanced back at Vernon Dursley, who was standing in his hallway in his dressing gown with the legal notification in his hand and the expression of a man who has just discovered that the ground he has been standing on was not, in fact, solid. Pale said nothing to him. He didn't need to. He pulled the door closed behind him. At the curb, Gomez held the car door for Morticia. She paused before getting in and looked back at the house. In the upstairs window, the small room, not the cupboard, the second smallest room in the house which Harry had apparently been moved to at some point, a room that contained a broken desk and a mattress and not much else, she could see a figure behind the glass. Small. Dark-haired. Holding something. Holding the card. "Monday," she said, to no one in particular. Or to him, perhaps, through the glass. She got in the car. Gomez drove. And on Privet Drive, the net curtains of 6 houses twitched with the particular urgency of neighbors who had just witnessed something they did not understand and could not wait to discuss, and the woman with the small dog was still standing at the corner, and the marigolds in the garden of number 4 nodded in the mild English breeze like they hadn't seen anything, which was a habit they'd developed over years. Wednesday's black cab arrived at the top of the road as the Bentley left it. She was dropped at the curb, paid the driver with coins she produced from a small purse shaped like a skull. She and her mother had matching ones, which was a statement as much as an aesthetic, and stood in front of number 4 for a moment. She had the additional records from Guildford. She had the supplementary material she hadn't shown anyone yet. She had 2 new items for the violation list, which would bring it to 76, and she had a suspicion, based on something she'd found in the medical archive, that would bring it higher still. She looked at the house. She looked at the cupboard-shaped section of wall she could identify from outside, because she had looked at the architectural plans at the records office at 7 that morning. She looked at the upstairs window, where Harry Potter had watched his family's legal reckoning arrive and leave, and where he was still standing, small and dark-haired and holding a card. Wednesday Addams had no conventional relationship with sentiment. But she reached into her satchel, pulled out a piece of paper, wrote something on it, folded it into an extremely competent paper crane. She had learned this at 6, from a book on origami she'd read out of interest in symmetry and then adapted for projectile purposes, and sent it through the open vent above the sitting room window with a precision that spoke to extensive practice. Then she walked back to the main road and called Gomez. 78, she said, when he picked up. We're at 74. You're behind. I found 4 more in Guildford. And I think there may be more in the St. Gregory's primary records that weren't in the initial pull. Good morning, Wednesday. The ministry is going to need to be notified formally today. I've drafted the application. I'll email it to Vex. Wednesday. What? A pause, and his voice when he came back was a register quieter. Did you see him? She watched the road. Through the window. And? She was quiet for a moment in the specific way she was quiet when she was deciding whether to say a thing. He looked like someone who had just found out that a thing they'd thought was impossible wasn't, she said. Which is actually very uncomfortable at first. Before it gets better. A longer pause. Yes, said Gomez. It is. Tell Mem the violation list is at 78. She'll want to update her notes. She hung up, hailed another cab, and was gone. In the sitting room of number 4, Petunia Dursley sat alone after Vernon had gone upstairs to make phone calls. The legal notification was still on the coffee table. 74 violations. Her sister's son, documented and accounted for in 74 ways that were, she knew with a precision she had been carefully not applying, absolutely accurate. She picked up the notification. She read the first page. She read the second. She stopped at violation 14, which was a school record from Harry's first year, in which a teacher had written, Potter seems very eager to please and afraid to be wrong, concerned he may be experiencing anxiety. Appears not to expect kindness. She put the paper down. She sat for a long time in her perfectly tidy sitting room, with her perfectly tended garden outside the window, and somewhere above her Harry was in his room holding a card with a number on it and a paper crane that had arrived through the vent and which, when he unfolded it, said in small precise handwriting, "Evidence is being gathered. You are not alone. W." He read it 3 times. Then he folded it back up and put it in the pocket of the 2 large trousers, carefully, next to the card, and sat on the edge of his mattress and tried to understand what it felt like when the ground had changed under your feet. He wasn't sure yet. But it felt like something. Chapter 3, The Cupboard Ledger. Monday arrived with the particular determination of a day that knows it has work to do. By 8 a.m., Tatiana Vex was in a glass-walled conference room in the Grimshaw, Vex and Pale temporary London office, a space they had taken on a 3-day lease in a building near Gray's Inn that had the kind of institutional gravity that legal proceedings seemed to generate on their own, and she was on her 4th cup of tea in her second argument with the Ministry of Magic's liaison office, a man named Podmore who had the voice of someone who had learned bureaucracy as a second language and was now more fluent in it than in anything human. The parallel notification was served Saturday, she said. Your office confirmed receipt. We confirmed receipt of the document, Podmore said, with the careful emphasis of a man distinguishing between 2 things that most people would consider identical. We have not confirmed that the matter falls within ministry jurisdiction in the current, the International Statute of Wizarding Welfare, 1980 revision, Article 7, subsection 3, Tatiana said. The welfare of any magical minor is a matter of joint jurisdiction between the ministry of the relevant territory and any properly constituted legal body acting on the minor's behalf. We are a properly constituted legal body. The minor is magical. The jurisdiction is therefore established. She paused. Would you like me to read you the statute, Mr. Podmore, or would you prefer to pull it up yourself while I wait? There was a silence on the line that had the quality of someone pulling up a statute. I'll need to escalate this, Podmore said finally. Please do. Escalate it to whoever makes the decision about whether the Ministry of Magic would like to be on the right side of this matter. I'll hold. She held. She drank her tea. Across the table, Chen was preparing the High Court filing with the focused efficiency of someone who had been awake since 5 and had decided that tiredness was a problem for a different day. Marsh was cross-referencing the violation list, which had reached 81 items that morning. Wednesday had found 3 more in the St. Gregory's primary school records that had been in a subfolder nobody had thought to check, and she had delivered this information at 6:45 a.m. by appearing at the office door with the records in hand and the expression of someone who considered the hour entirely reasonable. 81 violations. The number had a weight to it. Not because higher was better, none of it was better, any single item on the list was already damnable, but because 81 was the number that transformed pattern of neglect into something that had no softer name. Podmore came back. We're going to need 48 hours to, you have until 10 a.m., Tatiana said. At which point we file without ministry cooperation, which will be noted in the proceedings as the Ministry of Magic declining to participate in a child welfare matter involving one of their citizens. She paused. I'll leave it to you to consider how that reads. She hung up. Gomez arrived at 9 with pastries and Morticia, in that order, which was to say Gomez came through the door first carrying a white paper bag from a French bakery 3 streets over because he had gotten up at 7 and gone for a walk, which was the closest he came to restlessness, and Morticia came through the door behind him in a black dress that was doing something interesting with the shoulder structure and carrying the leather portfolio which now had additional tabs in it, and the room became about 15% more purposeful the moment she walked in. She sat down, opened the portfolio, looked at Wednesday. You found 3 more. In the attendance subfolder, Wednesday said. The school logged Harry as absent on 4 separate occasions where Vernon Dursley's work records, which are public, because he submitted them as part of a business rate assessment in 1987, show he was at work. Petunia's records show she was at a local garden club meeting on 2 of those same dates. Harry was 8 years old and apparently left alone in the house. That's violation 79, 80, and 81, Morticia said, writing. 81 confirmed, Wednesday said. Morticia wrote it down, capped her pen, and looked at the number on the page for a moment. Right, she said. The High Court filing went in at 9:47, which was 13 minutes before Tatiana's deadline to the ministry and which produced, at 10:03, a phone call from a different ministry official, a woman this time, with a voice that had significantly more authority and significantly less comfort in it than Podmore's, who introduced herself as Mafalda Hopkirk, Senior Undersecretary, and said she had been informed of the matter and wanted to discuss coordination. Wonderful, Tatiana said. Come to Gray's Inn by noon. We would prefer a ministry location, I'm sure you would, Tatiana agreed pleasantly. Noon, Gray's Inn. If you'd like to bring counsel, please do, we'll have a room prepared. Hopkirk arrived at 11:50 with 2 ministry lawyers who had the look of people who had been pulled from other assignments with insufficient briefing, and a folder of documentation that Tatiana assessed at first glance as defensive rather than cooperative, the ministry's version of building a wall while claiming to be opening a door. Morticia was not in the coordination meeting. She had other business. The emergency placement hearing for Harry was at 2 o'clock, in a family court that had been fast-tracked by a judge whose clerk had, according to Grimshaw, read the preliminary violation list on Friday afternoon and used specific words that Grimshaw had found very encouraging. Morticia went to collect Harry at noon. She went alone. Not because the others couldn't come, but because she had thought about it since Saturday and decided that this particular moment was not a legal operation, it was a different thing, and it required a different approach. So she drove to Privet Drive by herself in the Bentley, which she drove with a composed authority that slightly alarmed the other drivers on the A3, and she parked at the curb of number 4 and walked up the garden path and knocked on the yellow door. Petunia answered it. They stood looking at each other for a moment. They were not dissimilar in some ways, both tall, both very contained, both women who had made specific choices about who they would be in the world. The differences were what made the similarity complicated. "He's ready," Petunia said. "You told him I was coming?" "This morning." A pause. "He had the card. He'd kept it." She said this as if it was something that required acknowledgement, which it did. Morticia said nothing. "I know," Petunia said, and the words had the quality of something that had been in a room alone for a very long time. "I know what those papers said. I know they're accurate." Her chin was up, her hands were clasped, her voice was steady in the way that speaks to an enormous act of structural maintenance. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you otherwise." Morticia looked at her. "No," she said. "I didn't think you would. He's in the kitchen." Harry was in the kitchen, sitting at the table in his school clothes, which were the least oversized things he apparently owned, and were still not good, but were the best available, with a small backpack at his feet that contained everything he'd apparently decided to bring: the library books from the cupboard shelf, the paper crane, the card. He was eating toast, which Petunia had made, and he was eating it with the focused seriousness of someone who was not sure when the next meal was going to be and was applying appropriate attention to this one. He looked up when Morticia came in. "Hello," he said. "Hello." She looked at the backpack. "Is that everything?" He looked at it too. "I don't have much." "That's fine." She met his eyes. "We'll sort that out." He picked up the backpack. He stood. He looked at Petunia, who was standing in the kitchen doorway, and for a moment the three of them occupied a particular silence that had more in it than silence usually holds. "Aunt Petunia," Harry said. He said it carefully, like he was testing whether it was the right word. "What's going to happen?" Petunia looked at him, and something crossed her face that was neither love nor its opposite but something in the complicated territory between those things where most of real life happens. "People are going to make sure you're all right," she said. "That's what's happening." Harry nodded. It was a small nod, the kind that means "I'm recording this, I'll decide what to do with it later." He followed Morticia out. The family court was on the 3rd floor of a building near the Strand that had all the warm personability of a filing cabinet, and which on this particular Monday afternoon held Judge Patricia Holt, who was 58, had been on the family bench for 12 years, and had a quality of attention in the courtroom that made witnesses feel they had been read like a document. She had reviewed the preliminary materials on Friday. She had done so with complete judicial neutrality and with the private and unrecorded opinion that this was one of the most thoroughly documented welfare cases she had seen in 12 years, and that someone had done an extraordinary amount of work very quickly. Harry sat in the anteroom with Okafor, who had been assigned to keep him company and who had, somewhat unexpectedly, proven to be very good at this. He was quiet and large and calm in the way of things that take up space without threatening it, and he had produced, from somewhere, a pack of cards and a willingness to play snap with a level of competitive engagement that Harry found unexpectedly energizing. "Do you know what's happening in there?" Harry asked, during a lull. "The judge is reviewing all the evidence," Okafor said. "She's deciding where you're going to live while the longer legal stuff gets sorted out." "Where am I going to live?" "That's what they're deciding." Harry considered this. He put down a card. "Is it going to be bad?" "No," Okafor said, without hesitation, which made Harry look at him. "How do you know?" "Because Mrs. Addams is in that room," Okafor said, "and I have never seen her lose an argument about something she's decided matters." He picked up the card pile. "Your go." Inside the courtroom, Morticia was not losing the argument. The local authority solicitor, a tired-looking man named Hartley who had been given this case on Friday afternoon with insufficient notice and was doing his admirable best, was raising the standard procedural concerns about expedited proceedings, and Morticia was addressing each of them with a precision that left no room for the concerns to develop into obstacles. The emergency application is justified under Section 44 of the Children Act, Grimshaw said, because in the courtroom it was Grimshaw doing the formal work, with Morticia seated behind her in the way that meant she was not formally present but was very much present. The documented conditions constitute an immediate risk to the welfare of the child. The 81 items in the violation documentation, 81, Judge Holt said, looking at her copy. 81, my lady. Evidenced across 6 years of school records, medical records, and direct documentation gathered during our authorized visit on Saturday. Hartley rose. My lady, the expedited nature of this application has not allowed the local authority sufficient time. The local authority has had 6 years, Grimshaw said, and said it without any particular heat, which made it land harder. A silence. Mrs. Grimshaw, Judge Holt said, that observation is somewhat outside the scope of this hearing. With respect, my lady, it is entirely within the scope of this hearing. The 81 violations span 6 years. They are documented in publicly accessible records, school records, medical records, that were available to the local authority throughout. Item 14 in our documentation is a direct teacher notation expressing concern about the child's emotional welfare. That notation was made in 1986. We are now in 1988. The local authority has had, she glanced at her notes, approximately 730 days since that specific notation was made in which to act. Judge Holt looked at the documentation. She looked at Grimshaw. She looked, briefly, at the woman seated behind Grimshaw, who was looking at nothing in particular in the way that meant she was looking at everything. Where is the child currently? Holt asked. In the anteroom with our associate, my lady. He was brought from the Dursley residence this morning. Is he distressed? He is resilient, Morticia said, from behind Grimshaw, and then immediately added, with your ladyship's indulgence. She had not stood, which was technically improper, but she had said it with sufficient gravity that the room accepted it. Holt looked at her. Mrs. Addams. My lady. Your firm has moved with considerable speed on this matter. The matter warranted speed, my lady. You have also, and I say this as a pure observation, not a criticism, been considerably more present in this case than firms in a pure legal capacity typically are. Morticia held the judge's gaze. The child wrote a letter, she said. He wrote it to whoever helps children and sent it by the only means available to him. We received it. A pause. We take that kind of correspondence seriously. Holt was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. I imagine you do. The emergency order was granted at 3:15 p.m. It was a temporary care and placement order, pending full hearing, granting immediate removal of Harry Potter from the care of Vernon and Petunia Dursley and placing him in the temporary custody of Grimshaw, Vex and Pale in their capacity as legal representatives, with specific provision that he remain in the direct care of Morticia and Gomez Addams, who had filed as prospective guardians that morning. Prospective guardians. The application had been filed at 9 a.m., quietly and without announcement, tucked into the back of the morning's legal work like a card in a sleeve. Morticia had told Gomez at breakfast. He had looked at her for a moment over his coffee and then he had said, obviously, and gone back to reading the documentation. When Grimshaw came out of the courtroom, she found Morticia already standing, portfolio in hand, and she said, granted, and Morticia said, good, and turned to walk to the anteroom. Harry was losing at snap when she opened the door. Losing enthusiastically, actually. He and Okafor were in the middle of a spirited dispute about whether Harry had been a fraction of a second ahead, and the competitive argument had produced something on Harry's face that Morticia had not yet seen there. He was grinning. It was a complicated grin, lopsided and slightly surprised at itself, the grin of a boy who'd forgotten he knew how. He looked up when the door opened, and the grin stayed for a half-second before his face started to reassemble itself into the more careful expression, and then he looked at Morticia's face and read something in it. "Well," he said. "You're coming with us," she said. The grin came back. Less complicated this time. The Addams London Hotel had been upgraded at some point on Monday morning, by Gomez, to a suite that had a second bedroom, which had been furnished with things Wednesday had apparently sourced from somewhere between 8 and noon, a proper bed, actual bedding in dark colors because she had noted Harry's apparent lack of objection to the aesthetic, a small bookshelf with actual books chosen with the specific attention of someone who had read Harry's library book list and cross-referenced it with what she thought he'd probably enjoy, and on the desk, a small potted plant that was either a spider plant or something slightly more interesting depending on the light. There was also an envelope on the pillow. Harry picked it up when he came into the room, looked at the precise handwriting on the front, just H, and opened it. Inside was a single index card. On it Wednesday had written, "This room is yours for as long as needed. The books are yours permanently. The plant is called Mortimer and requires very little but appreciates being spoken to. Do not let Gomez teach you to fence until you've been here at least a week." Harry read it twice. He looked at the plant. He looked at the bookshelf. He looked around the room, which was real and solid and had a door that locked from the inside, which he tested twice because he couldn't quite stop himself, and which locked perfectly both times. He sat on the bed. He pressed his hand flat on the duvet. He looked at the ceiling. From the sitting room came Gomez's voice, animated and warm, talking to someone on the phone about the ministry meeting, and the sound of it, the ordinary sound of a person occupying a space confidently, as if the space belonged to them and they to it, moved through the wall and into the small room, and Harry sat with it for a moment. He picked up Mortimer the plant. He looked at it. "Hello," he said, very quietly, feeling slightly ridiculous. The plant did not respond, which was normal. Harry put it back on the desk and pulled his library books out of his backpack and lined them up on the shelf, and then he lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and felt, very carefully, the edges of something he was not yet prepared to call anything. At 6 that evening, the full team assembled for the briefing on the wizarding proceedings, which were where the real complexity lived. The ministry had, under Tatiana's deadline pressure, agreed to a preliminary joint hearing of the Wizarding Magistracy's Child Welfare Committee, not the full Wiesengemot, not yet, but a formal enough body that its proceedings would be on record, scheduled for Wednesday morning. This had been agreed with a speed that Tatiana described as suspicious. "They're moving fast because they want to control the frame," she said, standing at the head of the conference table in the hotel suite with her notes, while Harry ate pasta in the adjoining room with Okafor. "If they set the parameters of the hearing before we do, they can manage what gets examined and what gets to stay in the corner." "What's in the corner?" Gomez asked. "Dumbledore." Tatiana said the name with the particular restraint of someone who has feelings about it and is currently choosing to set them aside for professional purposes. Specifically, the 3 closed welfare inquiries. Wednesday's documentation of those is the most significant single piece of evidence we have, because it moves the narrative from the Dursleys were negligent, which is true and prosecutable on its own, to the Dursleys were negligent and the wizarding institutional structure actively prevented anyone from addressing it. Those are very different cases. Which is why they want to keep Dumbledore out of it, Grimshaw said. They're going to argue that the placement was a matter of extraordinary wartime circumstance. That it was a security decision, not a welfare decision, and that welfare standards cannot be applied to security measures. Tatiana paused. "It's not a stupid argument. It is a morally bankrupt one," Morticia said. "The two are not mutually exclusive in legal proceedings, unfortunately." Morticia looked at her. "Tell me about the blood protection charm. You mentioned it Saturday." Tatiana sat down, which meant she was about to go into depth, which meant everyone else sat up slightly. The blood protection is a real and functional piece of magic. When Lily Potter died protecting her son, she activated a sacrificial protection, an ancient form of magic that, according to Dumbledore's own report to the minister in 1981, created a shield that would protect Harry from Voldemort as long as he was living with a blood relative of his mother. Petunia Dursley is Lily's sister, so the charm is anchored to her. While Harry lives with her, the charm holds. Did it require the specific conditions? Pale asked. He had been listening with his document stillness. The deprivation. The cupboard. Was any of that necessary for the magic? Tatiana looked at him steadily. No. The charm requires residence with a blood relative. It does not require suffering. It does not require an understair cupboard. It does not require malnutrition or differential treatment or locked doors or any of the 81 items on that list. She let that sit for a moment. The protection charm is real. The justification of the conditions as necessary for the charm is fabricated. The room was quiet. Can we demonstrate that? Morticia asked. I've consulted with a magical forensics specialist in Edinburgh who will testify to exactly that on Wednesday. Tatiana opened her folder. The charm requires residence with the blood relative and a genuine emotional connection to the location as home. That's it. Some magical scholars argue the emotional connection element was never even required. At absolute maximum, what was needed was a house with Petunia Dursley in it. What was not needed, under any reading of the charm mechanics, was for the child to be kept in conditions that generated 81 welfare violations. Good, said Morticia. There's one more thing, Tatiana said, and her voice shifted into a register that made everyone at the table pay a different kind of attention. Wednesday's documentation of the 3 closed inquiries. In the third closure letter, the 1985 one, Dumbledore writes about the temporary discomforts of the child's domestic situation. I've spent the last 2 days thinking about what that phrase means, and here is what I think it means. She looked at the table. I think Dumbledore knew. Not the full extent, possibly not every one of the 81 items. But he knew the conditions were not good. He knew there were concerns. He chose to close the inquiries anyway. She folded her hands. That is not negligence. That is a decision. And decisions are a different legal and moral category. Gomez was very still, which for Gomez was the equivalent of a weather change. He was still in the way that meant something was happening underneath, in the deep registers. Morticia looked at him. Wednesday, Gomez said. Wednesday, who was sitting at the far end of the table with her satchel and the crossbow, which she had propped against her chair as if it was an umbrella, looked up. You found those documents in an archive that was labeled Miscellaneous Historical Correspondence, Gomez said. Correct. How did you know to look there? I looked everywhere, Wednesday said. That's the only method that works. Did anyone try to stop you? A beat. The archivist was reluctant to provide access to the 1985 subfolder. She said it had been restricted. I asked on what authority. She couldn't find the original restriction order. I waited while she looked. She was unable to locate it. The absence of a valid restriction order meant the materials were accessible. Wednesday's expression was one of total composure. I was very patient. I imagine you were, Gomez said. The restriction was almost certainly applied informally, Wednesday continued. Someone at the Institute asked someone at the archive to make those folders less findable without formally restricting them, because a formal restriction would itself be discoverable. It was meant to be buried by inattention rather than sealed by order. She paused. They underestimated how much inattention I'm willing to overcome. Tatiana was looking at Wednesday with an expression that was very close to professional appreciation. That restriction, even if it was informal, is itself significant. Someone wanted those closure letters not to be found. Yes, said Wednesday. I know. They worked until 9. Harry, in the adjoining room, fell asleep around 8 on the sofa with an open book on his chest and Okafor quietly reading beside him, and when Morticia looked in and saw this she looked at it for a moment and then came back to the table and picked up her pen and said nothing about it, because there are some things that are exactly right and don't require comment. At 9, she called a halt. She sent the associates back to the office to prepare Wednesday's archive documentation for submission. She sent Pale off to his hotel with the medical records and the instruction to have the cross-reference complete by 7 a.m. She sent Tatiana off with the magical forensics brief. Grimshaw stayed, because Grimshaw rarely left until the work was done and the work was not done, but she moved to the far end of the table with her own associates and became a quiet productive engine in the corner. Gomez sat across from Morticia with his tie loosened in a brandy he'd been working on for 2 hours. He drank slowly when he was thinking, which was one of the things Morticia found most characteristic of him, and he was looking at the table. "He's going to fight it," Gomez said. "Dumbledore," he meant, without saying it. "Yes. He's going to come into that hearing with everything he has, the wartime argument, the greater good argument, 30 years of institutional trust. He's going to be very good. I know. And we're going to dismantle every bit of it." "Yes," Morticia said. She said it the same way she'd said "I'm ready" since Tuesday, which was without any doubt at all. "We are." Gomez looked at her. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned her palm up and he kissed it, once, right in the center. "Magnificent," he said. She allowed the edge of a smile. "I haven't done anything yet. Cara mia. You've been doing something since the moment you opened that letter." He held her gaze. "He wrote to whoever helps children. He wrote it and sent it and you have not stopped for 5 days." "He was 8 years old," she said. "He was 8 years old and he taught himself to write small so as not to use too much space." She looked at the table. "I don't stop." "I know," Gomez said. "That's why I married you. Among other reasons." "Among many other reasons," she agreed, and picked up her pen. Tuesday was preparation. All of it was preparation, and there was a great deal of it. Tatiana ran 3 separate mock cross-examinations of their magical forensics witness, a small precise man named Archibald Fenwick who knew more about ancient protective charms than almost anyone alive and who had the quality of someone who would not be rattled on the stand because he genuinely did not experience the stand as rattling, he experienced it as a place to explain things he knew to be true, which was his natural state. Wednesday had moved her materials to the hotel suite conference space and was building what she called the ledger, which was a comprehensive, cross-referenced, formally organized presentation of all 81 violations plus the institutional failure analysis, plus the archive documentation, plus the forensics brief, in a format that could be submitted to both the Wizarding Magistracy and the Muggle Family Court. She worked on it with the focused energy of someone who had found the exact right use for her particular abilities, which was to say she was frighteningly good at it. The ledger was the name for the document. It was also, Morticia thought, the right word for what it was, not just a list of violations but an accounting. A reckoning in the original sense. The word came from the Old English for to tell, and that was exactly what it did. It told. It told everything, clearly and in order and with full evidential support, and when it was done it was 47 pages long and it told the story of a boy's 8 years in such complete and careful detail that there was nowhere to hide from it. Harry, on Tuesday, mostly stayed in his room and read. Morticia checked on him mid-morning, found him deep in a book, one of Wednesday's selections, a collection of Greek myths that he seemed to be approaching with the intensity of someone who had not previously been given a great deal to read and was now making up for lost time, and left him to it. In the afternoon, Gomez knocked on his door and asked if he wanted to come out to the hotel garden, and Harry came, and they sat outside in the mild afternoon sun and Gomez told him 3 stories and asked him 2 questions and listened to the answers with the complete attention that Gomez brought to everything he found interesting, and Harry, gradually and visibly, became slightly less careful. "Do you like Quidditch?" Gomez asked, at one point. Harry blinked. "I don't know what that is." Gomez looked at him. Then he looked at the middle distance in a way that suggested he was internally revising several things about the nature of what had been kept from this child. Right, he said. We'll come back to that. He paused. Do you know you're a wizard? Harry was quiet for a moment. Strange things happen, he said carefully. Around me. I don't know if I didn't know there was a word for it. There is, Gomez said. Several. He looked at Harry. Does that frighten you? No, Harry said, and then seemed surprised at his own answer. Good, Gomez said. It shouldn't. Aunt Petunia always got angry about it, Harry said. When things happened. She called it, he stopped, clearly deciding whether to say the word. Whatever she called it, Gomez said mildly, was wrong. What you are is not a bad thing to be. Harry looked at him. There are people, Gomez continued, who are afraid of things they don't understand and who turn that fear outward. It's a very common problem. It doesn't make them right. He stretched out in his chair. You have a considerable amount of information coming your way in the next several weeks. About what you are, about your family, about a great deal that should have been told to you much earlier. It will be a lot. Okay, Harry said. If at any point it becomes too much, Gomez said, you are allowed to say so. That's permitted. Harry looked at the garden. The hotel had rose bushes, red ones, coming into summer bloom. He looked at them with the expression he used when he was processing something that he hadn't filed anywhere yet. Nobody's really told me much before, he said. About anything. I know, Gomez said. We intend to correct that thoroughly. Why? Harry asked. Not suspicious, exactly, more like genuinely uncertain of the mechanism. Why would anyone bother? Gomez looked at him, and there was something in his expression that was entirely unperformed, not the theatrical warmth of Gomez in his element but something quieter and more foundational. Because you wrote a letter, he said. And you sent it out into the world and it reached us, and that makes you our business now. We take our business seriously. Harry looked at the roses. Also, Gomez said, you're an interesting person, Harry Potter. And we are a family that likes interesting people. Wednesday morning. The preliminary hearing of the Wizarding Magistracy's Child Welfare Committee convened at 10 a.m. in a room that was not in any building that appeared on any Muggle map of London, accessed through a door in a Diagon Alley establishment that was technically a bookshop but which mostly functioned as a waiting room for people who needed to get somewhere the maps didn't show. The committee room was oval, with tiered seating on 3 sides and a central floor space where the presenting parties stood. The committee comprised 5 witches and wizards of various ages and affiliations, chaired by a woman named Arabella Fudge, no relation to the minister, a distinction she made a point of, who had the quality of someone who had heard a great many things in this room and reserved judgment with practiced discipline. The walls were hung with tapestries showing scenes of magical justice that were technically allegorical but which moved slightly when you weren't looking directly at them. The ministry had sent 3 representatives, Hopkirk from their Saturday call, a legal counsel named Brandish who had the look of someone who'd been briefed thoroughly and had significant concerns about the brief, and a third official who had been introduced as an observer and who had not said anything yet but who had the particular quality of stillness that meant he was there for a specific purpose that had not been announced. Tatiana presented the wizarding case. She did it with the economy of someone who had 300% more material than she needed and had therefore selected only the pieces that cut deepest. The blood protection analysis, Fenwick testified with complete clarity and without any rattledness. The 3 closed welfare inquiries, Wednesday's documents, submitted formally and received by the committee with a quality of attention that said at least 3 of the 5 had not known about them. The placement documentation, or rather the absence of it, the single memo, the complete lack of formal guardianship instrument. Brandish rose to respond for the ministry with the wartime argument. He made it well. He was a competent lawyer and he had a competent argument. The extraordinary circumstances of 1981, he said, the threat posed by Voldemort, there was a visible flinch from the committee at the name, which Tatiana noted, had required measures that in peacetime would have been handled differently. The placement was a security decision. The welfare implications had been considered by whom? Tatiana asked, when Brandish paused to check his notes. By the relevant authority for magical child welfare in 1981, Tatiana said, was this committee's predecessor body. I have a complete record of their proceedings for the period 1980 through 1986. She produced the file. The Potter placement does not appear in any of those records. Not once. This committee was not consulted. This committee was not informed. She placed the file on the submission table. When you say the welfare implications were considered, Mr. Brandish, I need you to tell me specifically who considered them, because the record suggests the answer is one person who was not authorized to make the decision unilaterally and who actively prevented this committee's predecessor from doing its job. Brandish looked at his notes. He looked at Hopkirk. He said, the chief warlock of the Wisengamot at the time acted on the basis of, I'd like to submit, Tatiana said, Exhibit W7. This is the third welfare inquiry closure letter, dated March 1985, authored by Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore in his capacity as chief warlock, describing the conditions at the placement as, she opened the letter, the temporary discomforts of the child's domestic situation, which must be weighed against the catastrophic alternative. Exhibit W7 also includes our independent assessment confirming that the conditions described across the 81 documented violations were not, under any magical theory or legal doctrine, required for the functioning of the blood protection charm. She set the letter on the table. The conditions were not necessary. They were known. They were permitted. 3 separate attempts to address them were closed by the same individual. She looked at the committee. We are therefore requesting that this committee issue a formal summons to Albus Dumbledore to appear and give evidence at the full hearing, which we are requesting be fast-tracked in light of the severity and duration of the documented violations. The committee consulted among themselves in low voices. The third ministry official, who had been silent throughout, shifted slightly in his seat. Arabella Fudge looked at the letter. She looked at the 3 closure documents Wednesday had found. She looked at the ledger, 47 pages of it, which was in front of her and which she had been reading during the ministry's presentation with the focused attention of someone reading for comprehension rather than argument. The summons request is granted, she said. The full hearing is scheduled for Friday. Mr. Brandish, your office will ensure that Headmaster Dumbledore is notified today. Brandish said nothing for a moment. Then, he is currently abroad. Then he should begin traveling, Arabella Fudge said, in the tone of a woman who considered this a sufficient response, and moved to the next item. In the corridor outside, afterward, Tatiana stood with Morticia and allowed herself, briefly, the expression of someone who had just done something very well. He's been summoned, she said. Good, Morticia said. He's going to come in with everything. Every relationship, every argument, every gram of institutional authority he has. I know. Are you concerned? Morticia looked at the corridor, which was long and stone-floored and had tapestries on the walls and the kind of gravity that accumulates in buildings where important decisions have been made for a long time. I am not concerned, she said. I am prepared. The two feel similar from the outside but they are not the same thing. Tatiana looked at her. Do you know, she said, you're the most frightening client I have ever had? And I say that with complete professional admiration. Morticia's lips curved. I'll take that. Her phone, the mundane one, because she carried 2, buzzed. She looked at it. A text from Okafor, Harry finished the Greek myths. Asked if there were more books. Wednesday has already sent a list. Also he asked what time dinner is. She read the text. She looked at it for a moment. She typed back, tell him 7. And yes, there are more books. Tell Wednesday to include the Addams Family Library catalog. She put the phone away. Friday, she said to Tatiana. Friday, Tatiana agreed. Morticia turned and walked back down the corridor, and the tapestries on the walls moved slightly as she passed, and whether that was a draft or something else entirely, nobody in the corridor chose to investigate. Chapter 4. Wednesday makes her entrance. The Ministry of Magic's formal response to the summons arrived Wednesday morning, which was, as Gomez observed to Morticia over breakfast, either a coincidence or the universe demonstrating a sense of timing. It came by owl post, which meant it arrived at the hotel window at 7 a.m. and sat on the sill with the self-important bearing of official correspondence, and Gomez received it in his dressing gown, which was burgundy silk and had his initials on the pocket, because Gomez Addams received ministry owls and heads of state with identical personal presentation. He unrolled it, read it standing at the window with the morning coming in around him, and was quiet for a moment. Morticia looked at him from the breakfast table. Well? Dumbledore will attend Friday's hearing. He rolled the parchment back. He acknowledges the summons, confirms his attendance, and, a pause, expresses his sincere hope that all parties will approach the proceedings with the best interests of young Harry at heart. A silence. He's already framing it, Morticia said. Magnificently so. Gomez set the parchment on the sideboard. He's positioned himself as a fellow advocate for the child before he's walked in the door. He picked up his coffee, looking at the window, at the London morning happening outside. He's good. He's very good, Morticia agreed. That's what makes him the problem. Harry was still asleep. It was 7 a.m. and he had been staying up late reading, which Morticia had noted and permitted because the reading was enthusiastic and genuine and she was not going to interrupt enthusiastic genuine reading on a scheduling basis. Through the wall came no sound, which was the sound of a child sleeping in a real bed in a room with a door that locked from the inside, and Morticia had decided that she was not going to examine how she felt about that too closely because it would take her somewhere that was not useful for today's work. She picked up her pen. At 9, Wednesday called. She called Gomez's phone because she always called Gomez's phone, on the logic that Gomez answered immediately whereas Morticia answered when she was ready, and this morning Wednesday needed immediate. I found something last night, she said. Good morning, Wednesday. It is not a good morning yet, it might become one. I found something last night in the Hogwarts admissions records. Gomez was already across the room, picking up a pen. Go ahead. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry maintains a register of all magical children born in Britain. It's a self-updating record. When a magical child is born, their name appears. When they turn 11, a letter is generated automatically. Wednesday's voice had the quality it always had when she was presenting research, clean, precise, no wasted words. Harry's name has been on the register since his birth. His address on that register was updated 3 times between 1981 and 1988. Updated to what? That's the thing. Each update changed the address to a variation of Privet Drive, different house numbers, different street formatting, nothing that would flag as wrong on casual inspection but which a careful review shows are all functionally the same address. The first update was made in November 1981, 2 weeks after the placement. The second was in 1984. The third in 1987. She paused. Each update was manually authorized. By. The register shows authorization by the Office of the Headmaster of Hogwarts. Another pause. Dumbledore was personally monitoring Harry's file in the admissions register. He knew the address. He had access to the welfare flag system built into the register. Every magical child's record has a basic welfare monitoring function. It flags automatically if no magical activity is detected in the home environment beyond a standard threshold. And Harry's? Harry's welfare flags were suppressed. Manually. I found the suppression codes in the system log, which I accessed last night through the Institute's archive connection. A beat. The suppression means that the automatic welfare checks that should have been triggered every 2 years, standard procedure for any magical child placed with Muggle guardians, never sent alerts. Because someone told the system not to. Gomez said nothing for a moment. The quality of his silence was the same one the room had developed on Tuesday. Wednesday, he said. It means the 81 violations aren't just the Dursleys' failure. The monitoring system that should have caught this was deliberately disabled. Someone didn't just fail to check, they made sure the check couldn't happen. When are you arriving? My train gets in at 11. I'll come directly to the hotel. I'll tell your mother. Tell her about the suppression codes first. She'll want to add them to the ledger. I will. Also tell her good morning. She'll appreciate that. No, she won't, Wednesday said, but tell her anyway, and hung up. Morticia received the information about the suppression codes with the stillness she used for the things that made her most angry, which meant she received it with perfect, absolute composure, and then she picked up her pen and added 2 pages of notes to the ledger, and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Get Tatiana." Tatiana arrived at 10:30. She sat down, read Wednesday's notes, and said, "This changes the complexity of the Friday hearing significantly." How so? Until now, the strongest argument against us is going to be that Dumbledore acted in good faith under extraordinary circumstances, made judgment calls that in hindsight were wrong, and should be held accountable for those errors but is not guilty of deliberate wrongdoing. She set the notes down. The suppression codes remove the good faith defense entirely. You do not suppress an automatic welfare monitoring system in good faith. You suppress it because you do not want someone to see what the system would report. She looked at Morticia. This is the difference between a man who made a mistake and a man who made a choice. I know, Morticia said. Document it. We'll need Wednesday to present the technical evidence of the suppression. She found it, she can explain it. She'll be here at 11. Good. Tatiana hesitated, which was unusual enough that Morticia noticed it. Morticia. This is going to get very loud on Friday. The wizarding press is already outside the leaky cauldron. Someone leaked the summons. Someone in the ministry, Morticia said. Almost certainly someone who wants this story told. Not everyone in that building is trying to protect Dumbledore. Tatiana paused. He is extraordinarily well regarded. In both worlds, actually, his reputation in the Muggle academic community through certain channels is significant. The public hearing is going to generate responses that we need to be prepared for. Support, opposition, people who are going to say you're attacking a hero. Morticia looked at the window. The London morning was grey and determined, the kind of English weather that doesn't apologize for itself. Let them say it, she said. What we have documented speaks for itself. It does, Tatiana agreed. I just wanted to make sure you were ready for the noise. Tatiana. Morticia looked at her. I have been ready for the noise since I read a letter written by a child on a tree stump. The noise is fine. Wednesday arrived at 11:03, by which point Harry had emerged from his room, eaten breakfast with the focused appreciation of someone who had not yet become accustomed to breakfast being reliably available, and was sitting in the corner of the suite sitting room with a book in a quality of alert attention that meant he was reading but also tracking everything happening in the room, which Morticia had identified on the first day as his method of managing new environments. He learned the room before he settled into it. She respected this. He looked up when Wednesday came in. They had not met yet. Wednesday had been in Edinburgh when the Privet Drive visit happened, and then in Guildford, and then in the archive, and the one moment they'd nearly intersected Harry had been asleep. So this was the first time, and Harry looked at Wednesday the way he looked at everything, carefully, quickly, reading. Wednesday looked at him. You're Harry, she said. Yes, he said. Wednesday Addams. She set her satchel down on the conference table. I've been working on your case. I know, he said. You sent the crane. I did. Thank you, he said. Wednesday accepted this with a nod that acknowledged it without making anything of it, which was the right response and which Harry seemed to understand as such, because something in his posture relaxed approximately 3%. "The plant," he said. "Mortimer." "Yes. He's doing well." Wednesday looked at him for a moment. "He likes being talked to," she said. "I meant that literally." Harry nodded gravely. "I thought you might have." Something at the corner of Wednesday's mouth did something that was not technically a smile but occupied the same general region. She turned to the conference table and began unpacking her satchel, and the adults moved to join her, and Harry went back to his book, and it was not the last time Harry and Wednesday would talk but it was the first, and it established a tone that suited them both. The morning was technical and detailed and moved fast. Wednesday walked Tatiana through the suppression code documentation with the precise efficiency of someone who had spent the night making sure she could explain it to anyone at any level. Pale arrived at 12 and absorbed the new information in the way he absorbed everything, which was completely and without visible reaction until he'd processed it, and then he said, "This is the case," with the economy of someone who had just identified the load-bearing wall. "The whole structure," Gomez agreed. "The Dursley prosecution stands independently. The 81 violations are documented and prosecutable regardless of what happens with Dumbledore. But this," Pale tapped Wednesday's notes, "this is the institutional case. This is what you bring when you want to change not just what happened to one child but how the system that allowed it gets held to account." "Both," Morticia said. "We want both." Pale looked at her. "You'll have both." Lunch was ordered in because nobody wanted to stop. Harry ate with them, at the end of the table with his book face down, listening to the conversation with the quality of attention he developed over years of living in an environment where information about your situation was not given to you directly and had to be gathered laterally. Morticia noticed this and, partway through the afternoon, made a decision. She sat down next to him. "You have questions," she said. He looked at her. "A lot of them." "Ask them." He was quiet for a moment, organizing, which she recognized as the behavior of someone who had learned to prioritize because they expected to be cut off before they got through everything. "What's going to happen on Friday?" "A formal hearing in the wizarding legal system. We're going to present all the evidence we've gathered about what happened to you, not just what happened in the Dursley house, but how the wizarding establishment allowed it to happen. A man named Albus Dumbledore is going to be questioned." Harry processed this. "He's the one who put me there." "Yes." "Why did he do that?" Morticia looked at him steadily. "He believed he had a good reason. He was protecting you from a threat, a real threat, a magical one, and he decided that the best way to do that was to keep you with your aunt. But he also had options for how that was done, and he chose options that were not good for you, and when people tried to raise concerns about whether you were all right, he stopped them." Harry was quiet. "Did he know," he asked, "that it was, he stopped? That the conditions were bad?" Morticia said, using the direct word because he deserved direct words. "Yes. He knew." Harry looked at the table. He had his hands flat on it, palms down, and he was looking at them. And he thought that was okay. He thought it was a necessary cost, Morticia said. That is not the same thing as thinking it was okay. But it is also not enough of a difference to make it acceptable. Harry looked at his hands for a moment longer. Then he looked up. "What happens if you win?" he asked. "Several things. The Dursleys face prosecution for the violations. Dumbledore faces a formal censure at minimum, and we are pushing for considerably more than that. The Ministry is held to account for the failure of their monitoring system. And," she paused, "your guardianship is formally established." He looked at her. "With you?" "We have filed the application," she said. "The decision is the court's, not ours. But yes. With us. If that is what you want." He was very still for a moment. "Is there a," he started, and stopped. "What?" Is there a way that I could? He stopped again, and she could see him editing, reducing, making himself smaller in the phrasing, and she waited, and eventually what came out was, could I see the house? Before I decide. Where you live? Yes, Morticia said immediately. Absolutely yes. I don't want to be, he started again with the editing. Harry. She held his gaze. You can ask the full question. There's no version of it that's too much. He looked at her. He took a breath. I don't want to be somewhere that's only okay because it's better than a cupboard, he said. I want it to be a real place. Not just better. Morticia looked at him for a moment, and what she felt was something that went down to the bone, which she did not show because he did not need her feeling, he needed her answer. It is a real place, she said. It is very real and it is very unusual and it will not be like anywhere you've been. And we would like you to see it before you decide anything. She paused. That is a completely reasonable thing to ask, and I want you to know that the asking of it tells me something good about you. He looked at her. What does it tell you? That you know you deserve a real choice, she said. Not just an escape. He was quiet for another moment. Then he nodded, once, decisively, and picked up his book. Wednesday spent the afternoon building the supplementary archive. She had taken over a section of the conference table that had gradually expanded to cover most of its surface, and she worked in the way she always worked, with total focus, organizing material into the document with the structural precision of someone who understood that the difference between evidence and proof is the arrangement. At 2 o'clock, Augustus Pale came to stand beside her and look at the ledger in its current form, 49 pages, and growing. The timeline, he said. You've cross-referenced the welfare flag suppression dates with the closed inquiry dates. They correlate exactly, Wednesday said, without looking up. Each suppression code was applied within 2 weeks of a closed inquiry. He suppressed the automatic monitoring each time someone raised a concern, so that no further concern could be automatically generated. He was patching the holes, Pale said. Every time a hole appeared, he patched it. Wednesday turned a page. Which tells you 2 things. First, he was paying close enough attention to the system to know when the holes appeared. Second, he was committed to maintaining the arrangement at every point when he could have stopped and decided differently. This wasn't a single decision in 1981 under wartime pressure. This was an ongoing and repeated decision, made at minimum 3 times over 7 years. Pale looked at her. He had the expression he wore when he was making a legal assessment that he was confident about. Do you want to present this section yourself on Friday? Wednesday looked up from the document. I'm 16, she said. You found it, he said. You understand it better than anyone in this room. And you have a quality in front of a panel that I think will be very effective. What quality? You are not afraid of them, he said. At all. Not even slightly. And they will feel that. Wednesday considered this for a moment. I'll present the suppression code analysis, she said. You present the legal argument. I present the technical evidence. Perfect, said Pale. Wednesday went back to the ledger. 2 sentences later, without looking up, the crossbow is decorative. In the hearing. Obviously. Obviously, said Pale. At 4 o'clock, something unexpected happened. A knock at the suite door, which Gomez answered, revealed a witch in ministry robes who introduced herself as Hestia Jones, gave her affiliation as the Order of the Phoenix, a detail that landed in the room with specific weight, and said she needed 5 minutes. Gomez gave her 15, because Hestia Jones had the quality of someone carrying something they'd been carrying for a long time and needed to set down. She sat. She looked at Morticia. She looked at the table covered in documents. I've been inside the Order for 8 years, she said. I know Dumbledore. I know what he believes and I know why he believes it, and I am not here to defend what he did to that child. She put her hands flat on the table, a gesture of openness. But I want you to understand what you're walking into on Friday, because I think you need the full picture. We have a fairly full picture, Tatiana said. You have the legal picture. I have the other picture. Hestia looked at Morticia. Dumbledore believes, genuinely and completely, that Harry Potter is the only person who can defeat Voldemort. Not metaphorically. There is a prophecy. I don't know its exact text, but I know it exists, and I know Dumbledore has built his entire strategy around it for 7 years. She paused. From his perspective, and I want to be clear, I am not defending this perspective, I am describing it, he has been making impossible choices under the weight of knowing that millions of lives depend on one child surviving to adulthood. The conditions at Privet Drive are, she stopped, collecting herself, are unconscionable. I know that. I have thought that for years. But Dumbledore is not a monster. He is a man who decided that the survival of the world justified the suffering of one child, and he made that decision so completely and for so long that I think he stopped being able to see the child at all. The room was quiet. He stopped seeing Harry, Morticia said. Yes. Hestia's voice had something painful in it. He saw a function. A weapon. A variable in a strategic equation. Not a person. Harry was still in the corner. He was very still. Morticia looked at him. He was looking at the table, and his face was doing the very controlled thing it did when it was receiving something significant, and she made a decision. Harry, she said. He looked up. You heard that? Yes. Do you want to leave the room? He considered it with real seriousness. No, he said. I want to know. She nodded. She looked at Hestia Jones. Continue, she said. Hestia looked at Harry. Something complicated crossed her face. She looked at Morticia. He is going to come into that hearing and he is going to be exactly what he always is, brilliant, principled, convinced that he is right. He is going to have arguments about the blood protection, about the prophecy, about the necessity of the placement that are not stupid arguments. They are wrong, but they are not stupid. She folded her hands. He is also going to try to make it about the larger conflict. About Voldemort. About the stakes of the magical war. He is going to try to make Harry's individual suffering look small against the scale of what he is trying to prevent. He will not succeed, Morticia said. I know, Hestia said. That's why I'm here. She reached into her robes and produced a folded letter. She placed it on the table. This is a letter from Minerva McGonagall. She has known about the placement since 1981. She objected to it the night it was made. She spent all day watching the Dursleys and she told Dumbledore directly that they were the worst kind of muggles and he overruled her. She has not been comfortable with it since. Hestia pressed the letter flat. She will not testify against Dumbledore. She will not stand in that room and speak against him. But she wanted you to have her 1981 assessment of the Dursleys. In her own handwriting. As a document. Tatiana picked up the letter. She read it. She passed it to Morticia. It was dated November 1, 1981. It was written in a precise academic hand, and it said, among other things, the Dursley family represents everything I most deplore. This is not a suitable home for any child, let alone the child of James and Lily Potter. And then, further down, in what appeared to be angrier handwriting, as if the pen had been pressed harder, I shall not pretend I am happy about this arrangement. I am not. I am profoundly, fundamentally not happy about this arrangement. She knew, Morticia said. She knew, Hestia agreed. And she trusted him anyway, because she had trusted him for 40 years and the habit of trust is very hard to break even when you can see clearly that something is wrong. She stood. I don't know if any of that helps, she said. It helps us understand the terrain, Morticia said. Thank you. Hestia Jones looked at Harry one more time, and what was on her face was not pity, which would have been wrong, but something more like the expression of someone acknowledging a debt they cannot repay but need to name. Then she left. The room held the letter, and the weight of it, and what it confirmed. Pale picked up his pen. Harry was quiet through dinner. Not the small careful quiet he'd had when he first arrived. This was a different quality, more interior, like someone sitting with something large and trying to find the right relationship to it. Gomez sat next to him. He didn't say anything immediately. He served himself pasta and ate a portion and then said, very casually, "You know what I thought when I read your letter." Harry looked at him. "I thought, this is someone who has spent a very long time being told that their existence is a problem." Gomez ate another bite. "And who has decided, in spite of that, to reach out. That takes something." Harry looked at his plate. "The thing about being told you're a variable in someone's equation," Gomez continued, "is that it's a lie, and it's a particularly vicious kind of lie because it's dressed up as a compliment. You're important, so you must be sacrificed. You matter, so you must suffer. It takes the very thing that should protect you and turns it into justification for the opposite." He paused. "It is a lie, Harry. You are not a variable. You are not a function. You are a person, and your suffering was not a reasonable cost of anything." Harry was very still. What if, Harry stopped. Started again. What if the prophecy is real? What if there's really something I'm supposed to? Then we'll deal with that when we get to it, Gomez said, entirely without alarm, the way another person might say we'll sort the laundry when we get to it. That is a separate matter from whether you deserve to be treated like a human being for the first 8 years of your life. The answer to the second question is yes, absolutely, without any qualification. The first question is a future question. He looked at Harry. "One thing at a time." Harry looked at him. "You're not scared of any of it?" "I'm not, no." "Voldemort. The prophecy. Any of it?" "No." "Why not?" Gomez considered this. "Because being afraid of things wastes the time you could spend addressing them," he said. "And because in my experience, the things people build their fear monuments around are always less insurmountable on close inspection than they appear from a distance." He picked up his fork. "Also because I find the whole business considerably more interesting than frightening." Harry looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his own fork. "Gomez," he said. Can you teach me to fence?" Gomez's expression became very bright. "Wednesday said to wait a week." "Why?" "She said you'd need the week to feel settled before I introduced you to any of my enthusiasms." Harry thought about this. "I feel settled," he said. "It's been 4 days. It's been a very full 4 days." Gomez laughed, which was the full-body event it always was, and Morticia, from across the table, looked at the two of them with an expression that she kept for things that were exactly right. "This weekend," Gomez said. "After Friday. Deal?" Harry nodded. It was a different nod from the small careful ones he'd been using. This one had something in it that was forward-looking. Thursday was preparation of a different kind. The legal team was ready. The documents were ready. The ledger was complete at 53 pages and Tatiana had her examination structure and Wednesday had her technical presentation and Pale had the closing argument sketched out in his head and Grimshaw had coordinated with the High Court for the parallel Muggle proceedings which would follow the wizarding hearing. Everything was in order. The preparation Thursday required was human and logistical and involved, among other things, making sure that Harry knew what was going to happen on Friday and that he had the choice about whether to attend. Morticia had the conversation with him mid-morning, in the hotel garden, because he liked being outside and she had noticed this and filed it as information. "The hearing is at 10 a.m., she said. "You do not have to be there." "I know," he said. "I want to be. It's going to be difficult to hear." "I know." The things that were done, the way they're documented, you'll hear them listed again. Formally, in a legal space. I know, he said. I was there. I know what was done. He looked at the roses, which were fuller than they'd been on Tuesday. I want to be in the room when someone has to answer for it. Morticia looked at the roses too. All right, she said. Will you be next to me? He asked. He said it with the specific casualness of someone asking a question they consider important but don't want to seem like they consider important. Yes, she said. Okay. She nearly said something further and stopped herself, because she had noticed that Harry processed better with less and that the right amount of reassurance was significantly less than the amount that felt sufficient from the outside. She had stopped herself from over-reassuring him 3 times since Saturday, each time with some effort, and each time had been right. There's one more thing, she said. Dumbledore will see you in that room. He has never met you, not to your knowledge, anyway. Whatever he does when he sees you, she paused, whatever he does, you do not owe him anything. Not your understanding, not your forgiveness, not your consideration for what he believed he was trying to accomplish. Those may come in time. They are not required today. Harry looked at her. People are going to want you to be gracious about it, she said. Because he's a hero to a lot of people and you're the child and children are supposed to be gracious. You don't have to be. Her voice was level. You can just be there. That's enough. He was quiet for a moment. What if I want to say something to him? Then you say it. In the hearing? There are provisions for the affected party to make a statement. You are the affected party. She met his gaze. If you want to speak, you speak. He turned this over. I'll decide in the morning, he said. Good, she said. That's the right amount of time. That evening, Wednesday found Harry in the sitting room at 9 p.m. reading a book about magical creatures that Gomez had located from somewhere, and she sat down on the opposite sofa with the ledger, which she was doing a final review of, and they were companionably silent for 20 minutes. Can I see it? Harry asked, eventually. Wednesday looked up. The ledger, he said. Can I see what it says? She looked at him for a moment, assessing in the way she assessed things, directly, without pretense of politeness around the looking. Yes, she said, and passed it to him. He opened it. He read the cover page. He turned to the violation list. He read slowly and carefully, starting at violation 1, and Wednesday watched him read it and did not look away, because she was not the kind of person who looked away from things that were important, and this was important. He read for a long time. He got about 20 pages in. He stopped at violation 37, which was one of the teacher notes, a substitute teacher who had written, only 2 years ago, the child appears to expect punishment for ordinary mistakes and apologizes excessively for minor errors, consistent with a punitive home environment. He stopped at that one for a while. Then he closed the ledger carefully and held it for a moment with his hands on the cover. It's all real, he said. Not as a question. Yes, Wednesday said. It happened. Yes. And tomorrow they have to, someone has to look at it and say that it happened. Yes, Wednesday said. And say that it was wrong. That is specifically what the hearing requires them to do. He held the ledger for another moment. Then he gave it back to her. Wednesday, he said. Yes. Thank you. For finding all of it. He paused. I know it's your job. But also thank you. Wednesday took the ledger back and set it on the table. She looked at him with the expression she used when she had decided to say a true thing. I didn't do it because it was my job, she said. I did it because it should be done and because I am very good at finding things that people have tried to make unfindable. She paused. And because you put a letter on a tree stump and I find that the kind of thing that deserves a full response. Harry looked at her. I've never had anyone who, he started, and stopped. I know, Wednesday said. Neither had I, before my parents. She picked up the ledger. Get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be significant. He went to bed. He didn't sleep immediately, but he was in the Real bed with the door locked from the inside and Mortimer the plant on the desk and the books on the shelf, and he lay in the dark and thought about what it meant to have a thing be witnessed, not pitted, not performed over, not minimized or managed, just witnessed, completely, by people who had looked at it fully and said, "This is real and it was wrong and we are going to stand in a room and make that matter." He thought about that for a while. Then he got up, went to the desk, found paper and a pen, and wrote something. He folded it and put it in his pocket. He went back to bed and this time he slept. Morticia, in the room down the hall, was still awake at midnight, which was not unusual. She was not working. She was sitting at the window looking at the London night, which had the particular quality of city nights, the light that doesn't quite go dark, the low constant hum of a million people all alive and moving in their orbits. Gomez came to sit beside her. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. "Are you ready?" She looked at the city. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the letter. About him on the tree stump." She paused. He had no reason to believe anyone would come. He did it anyway. He put the letter on the stump because a library book told him we existed, and he had nothing else, and he tried. She turned from the window. That kind of trying deserves something equal in return. That's what tomorrow is. Gomez looked at her. "Every piece of evidence," she said. "Every page of the ledger. Every legal instrument and every argument and every moment when we refused to soften what was done or make it easier for the people who did it. All of it, for him." She was still in the way of deep water. He tried. "We answer." Gomez took her hand. "Let's go answer," he said. Chapter 5, The Greater Good on Trial. Friday arrived like a held breath finally released. The hearing room of the Wizarding Magistracy's Child Welfare Committee full sitting was larger than the preliminary room had been, oval still, but with more tiers, higher ceilings, and the particular charged quality of a space that had been told something important was going to happen in it and had prepared accordingly. The tapestries on the walls had more movement than usual. The torches burned steadier. There were perhaps 40 witches and wizards in the tiered seating, which was open to members of the magical legal community and a limited number of press, and the low murmur of them filled the room with the specific tension of an audience that knows it's about to see something it will remember. The committee sat at the high bench. Arabella Fudge in the center, for colleagues arrayed around her. She had the quality this morning of someone who had read everything submitted to date and had formed clear views and was maintaining complete judicial neutrality over those views through an act of considerable professional discipline. The Addams Grimshaw Expale team took the presenting party's position on the left side of the floor. Gomez and Morticia were not counsel. Counsel was Tatiana and Pale and Grimshaw, but they were present as the formal applicants and as Harry's prospective guardians, and they sat in the first tier of seating directly adjacent to the floor, close enough that the room understood their relationship to the proceedings without needing to be told. Wednesday was at the evidence table with the ledger and her supplementary materials. She had the crossbow in her bag and had made a decision, which she had communicated to no one, about whether it stayed there. Harry was beside Morticia. He was wearing the first new clothes he'd owned in his memory. Morticia had taken him to a shop on Thursday afternoon, a quick and entirely non-negotiable hour in which she had pointed at things and he had tried them on and she had said yes or no with the brisk certainty of someone who knows what they're looking at, and the result was that he looked like himself rather than like a child wearing someone else's clothes, which was its own kind of statement. He had the folded paper in his pocket. His hands were still on his knees. His face was doing the controlled thing, but underneath it, if you knew how to look, there was a quality of readiness. On the right side of the floor, the ministry's team arranged themselves. Brandish, looking like a man who'd had a difficult week and expected it to continue. Hopkirk, more composed. Two additional legal figures Tatiana had identified as brought in specifically for today, senior practitioners, the kind that get called when the ministry needs to look serious. And then Albus Dumbledore. He arrived at 9:58, which was 2 minutes before the hearing began, and he entered with the timing of someone who understood entrances, not dramatic, not late, but precisely calibrated. He was tall, with the silver beard and the half-moon spectacles and the robes that managed to be both extraordinarily bright and somehow not frivolous, and he moved through the room with a quality that was not arrogance but was something that rhymed with it, the quality of someone who had been the most important person in most rooms for a very long time and had stopped noticing it the way fish stop noticing water. He sat at the respondents' table. He arranged his robes. He looked at the committee with an expression of engaged, serious attention. Then he looked at the presenting party's side of the room. He looked at Gomez first, briefly, assessing. He looked at the legal team. He looked at Wednesday, who met his gaze with the expression of someone who had found his suppression codes in a mislabeled archive and was perfectly fine with him knowing it. Then he looked at Morticia, and for a fraction of a second his expression did something very small, a recalibration, like a navigator updating for a current he hadn't expected. Then he looked at Harry. Harry looked back at him. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds something passed between them that was not warm and not simple and not what Dumbledore's expression seemed to have expected. Harry was not cowed. He was not awestruck. He was not grateful or appealing or any of the things that 8 years of designed circumstances might have been expected to produce. He was a small boy with green eyes who looked at the man who had made decisions about his life with the steady, clear regard of someone who had read every page of the ledger the night before. Dumbledore's expression shifted, just fractionally, in a way that might have been the first moment of something he would process later. Then Arabella Fudge called the hearing to order. Tatiana opened. She was, at her best, like a very precise instrument, not showy, not theatrical, working with the clean economy of someone who knew the value of every word and didn't spend an extra one. She laid out the case in 7 minutes, who Harry Potter was, what had been documented, what the institutional failures were, and what the hearing was being asked to establish. She did it without ornament and without mercy, and by the time she sat down the room had the quality of people who had just watched something be set up very carefully and knew the next part was going to be significant. Brandish rose for the ministry. He was good, as Tatiana had said he would be. He acknowledged the violations directly, which was smart. He didn't try to minimize them, because the ledger was on the table and minimization would have been immediately and visibly stupid. What he did instead was argue context. The magical war of 1970 through 1981 had been catastrophic. Voldemort's power had been a genuine and existential threat. The decisions made in 1981 had been made under extraordinary pressure by a man who had more information about that threat than anyone else alive. The blood protection charm was a genuine and significant defensive measure that had kept Harry Potter alive. The question before this committee, Brandish said, is not whether the conditions at the Privet Drive placement were ideal. They were not, and the ministry acknowledges this. The question is whether the decisions that led to those conditions constitute culpable wrongdoing, or whether they constitute the imperfect execution of a genuine and necessary strategy by a man of extraordinary judgment and demonstrated commitment to the magical world's welfare. He sat down. Pale rose. He didn't pace, didn't use gesture, didn't perform. He stood at the center of the floor with his hands clasped behind his back and his voice at the same level it was always at, which was moderate and complete and impossible to dismiss. My colleague has described the conditions at the placement as not ideal, he said. I want to offer a more precise description, so that we are all working from the same understanding. He looked at the committee. 81 violations. I am not going to read all of them today, they are in the ledger which the committee has before them, and I would invite the committee to read every single one at their leisure. But I would like to name several, so that the word ideal does not remain the operative frame. He named them. He named the cupboard. He named the nutrition records. He named the lock on the outside of the door. He named the teacher's note from 1986 about a child who expected punishment for ordinary mistakes. He named the birthday, and the absence of it, across 6 years of documentation. He named them in his voice that was like old wood, and the room was very quiet. "These are not the conditions of a placement that was imperfectly executed," he said. "These are the conditions of a child who was systematically treated as less than human for 8 years. And the question before this committee is not simply whether those conditions existed, they did, they are documented in 53 pages of evidence, but whether the wizarding institutional structure that was designed to prevent exactly this outcome was deliberately and knowingly prevented from doing its job." He paused. "My colleague Miss Addams will now present the technical evidence regarding the suppression of the automatic welfare monitoring system." Wednesday stood. She walked to the evidence table, opened her materials, and looked at the committee. She looked at them the way she looked at everything, directly, without apology, with the particular confidence of someone who was not asking the room's permission to exist in it. "The Hogwarts admissions register," she said, "maintains a welfare monitoring function for all magical children placed with Muggle guardians. The function is automatic, it runs on a 2-year cycle and generates an alert if the monitored conditions fall below a defined threshold. It has been in operation since 1975. She placed a document on the evidence table. Harry Potter's record in that register contains 3 suppression codes, applied at intervals between 1981 and 1987. Each suppression code disables the automatic monitoring cycle for a defined period. Each of these codes was manually applied. Applied by whom? Arabella Fudge asked. The authorization log for each suppression code identifies the authorizing office as the headmaster of Hogwarts. Wednesday looked at Fudge directly. Albus Dumbledore manually suppressed the welfare monitoring of Harry Potter's placement 3 times over 7 years. He did so within 2 weeks of each of the 3 welfare inquiry closures, which means that each time a human-initiated concern was raised and then closed, the automatic system was also disabled to prevent it from raising the concern independently. The room murmured. "These are the suppression code records," Wednesday said, producing the documents. "These are the authorization logs. These are the inquiry closure letters, cross-referenced by date. The correlation is exact. There is no reading of this evidence under which the suppression codes were applied by accident or oversight." She set the last document down. "This is not a story about a man who didn't know. This is a story about a man who looked, saw, and made a choice not to let anyone else look." She sat down. The room was not quiet the way it had been during Pale's statement. It was a different quality, not solemn but agitated, the sound of people recalibrating. Dumbledore had listened to all of this with his hands folded on the table and his expression attentive and considered. He did not look rattled. He did not look defensive. He looked like a man listening carefully to an argument he intends to answer thoroughly. Fudge looked at him. "Mr. Dumbledore. You may respond." Dumbledore stood. And here was the thing about him, the thing that Morticia had known since reading his response to the summons, the thing that Hestia Jones had tried to convey, the thing that Tatiana had been preparing for. He was very, very good at this. He didn't start with the suppression codes. He started with Harry. "I have known about Harry Potter since before he was born," he said, and his voice had the quality of a man telling a story he had carried a long time. Not performing sorrow, something more genuine than that, which was what made it difficult. "I knew his parents. I knew his mother, who was one of the finest witches of her generation, and his father, who was brave and loyal and died trying to protect his family." He paused. "I have thought about Harry every day for 8 years. Not as a function. Not as a variable. As James and Lily's son. Harry, in the first tier of seating, was very still. The decision I made in November 1981 was the hardest of my life," Dumbledore continued. "Not the hardest strategic decision. The hardest decision of any kind. I knew what I was asking of that child. I knew the Dursleys were not ideal." He looked at the committee. "What I also knew was this: there exists a prophecy, made in 1980, which describes a child with the power to defeat the Dark Lord. That child is Harry Potter. And the blood protection charm anchored to his mother's sacrifice was, at the time of my decision, the only reliable magical shield standing between that child and a dark wizard who had already killed dozens of the finest witches and wizards of our time and who, despite his apparent defeat, I had strong reason to believe would return. The charm required residence, Tatiana said, rising briefly. Not suffering. The charm required a home where Harry would be safe, Dumbledore said, and his voice was gentle, which was its own kind of strength. Safety, in the context of what was coming, was not simply about comfortable living conditions. The Dursleys they were ordinary people. Deeply ordinary. And there is a particular safety in deep ordinariness when what is hunting you is drawn to the extraordinary. He looked at the committee. My calculation was wrong. I have known it was wrong for some time. The question is whether it was wrongly motivated. The suppression codes, Pale said, from his seat. Yes. Dumbledore looked at him. The suppression codes. He took a breath. Each time a welfare concern was raised, he said, I reviewed it. Personally. I visited the placement, not frequently enough. I will not insult this committee's intelligence by claiming I monitored it with sufficient regularity, but I visited. I spoke with Harry on 2 occasions. He was unhappy. I knew he was unhappy. He said this with something that was not performed regret, it had the quality of a wound, actually, the quality of a thing that had been there a long time and had been looked at with various degrees of honesty at various times. I told myself that unhappiness was survivable. That the alternative, a life lived in the open, where Voldemort's remaining followers could find him, where the remnant of his power might reach him before Harry was old enough to be properly trained and protected, was worse. I suppressed the monitoring codes because I did not want the automatic system generating alerts that would bring in officials who did not have the full picture, who did not know about the prophecy, who might make decisions that prioritized Harry's comfort over his survival. He looked at the committee. I made a choice to protect his life at the expense of his welfare. I did not make it easily. I did not make it once. I made it repeatedly, which this committee has correctly identified as the most damning aspect of my conduct. Not a single terrible decision made in wartime crisis, but a sustained commitment to a calculation that I continued to make long after the immediate crisis had passed. He paused. I will not tell you that I believe the 81 documented conditions were necessary. They were not. I will tell you that I believed at each decision point that removing Harry from that placement carried risks that outweighed the costs of keeping him there, and that I was wrong. Not about the risks. About the costs. He sat down. The room breathed. Morticia had been watching him throughout. She had watched the argument construct itself, brilliant, genuine, self-aware in its acknowledgement of error, sophisticated in its distinction between wrongly motivated and simply wrong. She had watched the committee respond to it, seen the slight softening in 2 of the 5 members who were susceptible to a man who told a story about impossible choices with evident sincerity. She understood, in the way she understood people, not from sympathy but from precision, that Dumbledore believed every word he had said. That was what made him the most dangerous person in the room. Fudge looked at the committee. She looked at Tatiana. Cross-examination. Tatiana stood. She picked up a single sheet of paper, looked at it briefly, set it back down. She didn't need it. She walked to the center of the floor and looked at Dumbledore. You visited the placement twice in 8 years, she said. On 2 recorded occasions, yes. The monitoring suppression covered a period of 7 years. Yes. In your second visit, which our records show occurred in 1986, when Harry was 6 years old, what did you observe? Dumbledore's hands, folded on the table, were very still. He appeared thin. He was, a pause, he was wearing clothes that were too large for him. Did you see the cupboard? A longer pause. I was aware of it. Did you see it? Yes. You saw a 6-year-old child sleeping quarters, Tatiana said. You saw that they were a cupboard under the stairs, with no natural light, with a lock on the outside. You saw this and then you left and you suppressed the monitoring code within 12 days. I don't need the explanation, Mr. Dumbledore. I need to establish, for the committee's record, that you saw the cupboard in 1986, that you assessed it as you assessed everything regarding this placement, and that your subsequent action was to suppress the automatic monitoring. Is that accurate? Dumbledore looked at her. Yes, he said. Thank you. She let it sit for precisely the right amount of time. You've described your motivation as protecting Harry's life over his welfare. Can you point me to the documented evidence, any evidence, that leaving the monitoring active would have created a specific security risk to Harry's life? Dumbledore looked at her carefully. The prophecy is not a public document. I'm not asking about the prophecy. I'm asking about the security risk. Specifically, if the automatic monitoring had generated an alert in, say, 1984, and officials had come to review the placement, what security risk does that create? Officials interacting with Harry's placement could create records, discussions, pathways of information that might reach Voldemort's followers? Yes. Voldemort, at that point, had been apparently defeated for 3 years. Apparently defeated, Dumbledore said. I had reason to believe the defeat was not permanent. And those reasons were known to you alone? Yes. Not shared with this committee. Not shared with the ministry. Not shared with the officials who might have reviewed the placement. So when you suppressed the monitoring, you were making a security judgment based on information that you held exclusively and that no one else was in a position to evaluate? A pause. That is accurate. So the decision was, I have information that only I know, that I am not sharing, that justifies conditions for this child that I have personally observed to include a locked cupboard, and I am going to maintain those conditions based on a judgment that no external party can verify because I have not told them what I know. Tatiana looked at him levelly. Does that accurately characterize what you did? Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. It was a small word, and he said it with the quality of someone setting down something heavy. Thank you, Tatiana said, and sat down. The room was very, very quiet. Morticia turned to look at Harry. He had been completely still through the cross-examination. His hands were still on his knees, and his face was doing something she had not seen it do before, which was not the controlled nothing but something more complex, the expression of someone hearing a thing they had needed to hear, not because it was a comfort but because it was a confirmation, a recognition, a door opening onto a room where the truth of your experience sat waiting to be acknowledged. He met her eyes. She gave him the smallest nod. He looked at the floor. He put his hand in his pocket and touched the folded paper. Fudge spoke. This committee will take a 15-minute recess. In the corridor outside the hearing room, the murmur of the assembled observers became a proper conversation, and it was not a comfortable one. Morticia could hear the shape of it from where she stood near the window with Gomez. The divide was audible, the tension between people who had trusted Dumbledore for decades and people who had been privately uncomfortable with something they now had a language for. Gomez was watching the room with the attentiveness he brought to things he found genuinely interesting. He's not finished, he said quietly. No, Morticia agreed. He has something else. He held something back. The prophecy, she said. He hasn't introduced it formally. He's building to it. Will Tatiana be ready for it? Tatiana has been ready for it since Tuesday. Morticia looked at the corridor. The prophecy is his final argument. It's the argument he believes makes everything else secondary. There is a dark wizard, there is a child destined to face him, and everything that child suffered was in service of his survival to fight that battle. She paused. It is an argument that requires you to believe that a child's purpose justifies their suffering. That destiny is more important than personhood. Gomez looked at her. It won't work, she said. Not because the prophecy isn't real. It may be real. It's irrelevant. Why irrelevant? Because prophecies are not parenting philosophies, she said. Gomez looked at her with an expression that was, in its way, reverent. Tish, he said. Not now, she said, not unkindly. After. He kissed her wrist anyway. Harry had gone to find water, which meant he had gone a short way down the corridor with Okafor and was standing at a window looking out at the alley below. Wednesday found him there. She stood beside him and looked out the window too. You're going to make the statement, she said. It was not a question. He took the paper from his pocket and looked at it. How did you know? You wrote it last night. I heard you up. He looked at the folded paper. You don't have to, she said. I know. He held it in both hands. I want to. He stopped. What? What if it doesn't? He stopped again. Then, what if he just has another argument? For whatever I say. What if he just explains it away? Wednesday looked at the alley below. A cat was sitting on a dustbin with the dignity of something that had claimed the highest available surface. He might try, she said. He is very good at explaining things. She paused. But there is a difference between explaining something and making it all right. He can explain every decision he made for 8 years and it still doesn't make it all right. And you saying that, out loud, in that room, to him, is not something an explanation can cover. Because it's not an argument. It's a fact. Harry looked at the paper. The things that happen to you, Wednesday said, are not things that get balanced out by a sufficient explanation. They just happened. The explanation tells you why someone let them happen. It doesn't undo them. She looked at him. When you speak, you're not making an argument. You're telling the truth. Those are different things and only one of them is vulnerable to being argued back. Harry was quiet for a moment. You're very good at this, he said. I know, she said. Come on. They're going back in. The second session opened with Dumbledore requesting the opportunity to introduce additional testimony regarding what he called the broader context of the placement decision. Fudge granted it. Brandish rose and formally entered the prophecy, not its full text, which remained sealed, but a ministry summary confirming its existence and its relevance to Harry Potter's identity as a significant figure in the conflict with Voldemort. The safety of the magical world, Brandish said, has depended and continues to depend upon Harry Potter surviving to fulfill the role described in this prophecy. The measures taken to ensure his survival, while imperfect in their execution, were rooted in a genuine and accurate assessment of the risk. Pale rose. The prophecy is a document concerning Harry Potter's future role in a conflict. It says nothing about his living conditions. It says nothing about whether he sleeps in a cupboard. It says nothing about nutrition or clothing or whether he is locked in on school nights. He looked at the committee. The introduction of the prophecy into this hearing is an attempt to make the question of this child's welfare a subsidiary concern to the question of his strategic value. We would respectfully suggest that the committee decline to accept that framing. Fudge looked at Brandish. The witness has introduced the prophecy as context. I will allow it as context. I will not allow it as justification. There is a difference and this committee will maintain it. Brandish sat. He had the look of a man whose best remaining argument had just been cordoned off. Dumbledore spoke without rising. May I address the committee directly? Not through counsel. Fudge paused. You may. He stood. He looked at the committee. He looked at the room. I have sat here this morning, he said, and heard my decisions examined thoroughly and correctly. I have been cross-examined with great skill and I have answered honestly, because I believe honesty is the only thing this moment deserves. He looked at his hands for a moment, briefly. I made a choice for this child that was wrong in ways I understood and ways I did not. I told myself the story of necessity until it became the only story I could hear, and in doing so I stopped being able to hear the other story, the one about a boy in a cupboard who deserved better. He looked up. I have no defense of that. Only an explanation, which is not the same thing. He turned, and looked at Harry. Harry, he said, and his voice was gentle and direct, and it was the voice of a man who had rehearsed a great deal and had also, underneath the rehearsal, something genuine. I owe you more than this room can provide. I owe you the years in which I looked at what was happening to you and chose not to intervene sufficiently, and those years are not returnable. He paused. I believe you will be extraordinary. I have always believed that. What I failed to understand for too long was that belief in someone's future is not a substitute for protecting their present. The room was very still. Harry was looking at Dumbledore. He was looking at him with the clear, green-eyed regard he'd used since the hearing began, and Morticia, beside him, felt him make the decision. He reached into his pocket. He unfolded the paper. He stood. Every head in the room turned. Fudge looked at him. This is, she checked her notes, Harry Potter, the affected party. Mr. Potter has registered for a statement under Wizarding Magistracy Procedure, Clause 12. He may speak. She looked at him. Go ahead. Harry looked at the paper. He held it for a moment, and then he folded it back up and put it in his pocket, because he had decided he didn't need it. He looked at Dumbledore. I heard what you said, he said. His voice was steady and clear, and it was the voice of a boy who had learned to speak carefully and was choosing, right now, to speak fully. About owing me years that can't be given back. I understood what you meant. Dumbledore was watching him. I spent 8 years in a house where I wasn't allowed to ask questions, Harry said. Not about my parents, not about why I lived in a cupboard, not about anything. And nobody came to explain it to me. Nobody told me, here's why things are the way they are, here's what we decided about your life and why. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. You knew where I was for 8 years. You knew what it was like. You chose it, and you chose it again, and you chose it again. And the explanation you just gave, about the prophecy, about the war, about what you believed, I actually understand it. I can follow the logic. He paused. I'm 8 years old and I can follow your logic, and I still don't think it's enough. A sound in the room. Not a word, just a shifting. You talked about my future, Harry said. About what you believe I'll be. But you didn't protect me. You protected what you needed me to become. That's different. His voice was completely level. I don't know yet what I want for my future. I don't know about prophecies or what I'm supposed to do. What I know is what the last 4 days have been like. What I know is what it felt like to find out that people had been looking for a way to say that what happened to me was wrong. He glanced briefly at Morticia, and it was barely a glance, a fraction of a second, but it was there. Nobody had to do that. They did it because they thought it mattered. Because I mattered. Not because of what I might do later. Just, now. He looked back at Dumbledore. I'm not telling you I hate you, he said. I don't know enough about you yet to know what I think. I'm telling you that the explanation isn't the same as the thing being all right. You said that yourself, actually. He paused. I heard you say it. He sat down. The room was completely still for a long moment. Dumbledore looked at Harry, and the expression on his face was one that Morticia thought he had not expected to wear in this hearing, not defensiveness, not argument, not the gentle authority he wore so naturally. Something older than those things. Something that had the quality of an actual reckoning, which is different from an explanation because it doesn't close anything, it just makes the truth of the thing fully present. He said nothing. He simply nodded, once. The committee took 40 minutes to deliberate. The doors closed and the hearing room held its full population in a strange suspended conversation, some people talking quietly, some sitting alone, some watching the closed doors. Gomez found a corner bench and sat on it, and Morticia sat beside him, and they were quiet in the way they were sometimes quiet together, the way of two people who have been through something and are sitting with it before they process it into words. "He's not a bad man," Gomez said. "No," Morticia said. "He's something almost more troubling than a bad man. He's a good man who stopped applying his goodness to the specific human in front of him because he was too busy applying it to the abstract millions behind him." "It's a very old failure," Gomez said. "Very old." She looked at the closed doors. "It doesn't make the cupboard smaller." "No." Harry was on another bench across the hall with Wednesday, and from where Morticia was sitting she could see the two of them, Wednesday reading something, Harry looking at the floor with his hands between his knees, the folded paper back in his pocket. He'd said what he'd gone there to say, and he was doing the thing people do after they've said something they needed to say, which is sit with the fact that saying it didn't make the ground shake, that the world is much the same after as before, and figure out what that means. She watched him notice the sameness and decide it was okay. Okafor came to sit near them, and at some point he had acquired a bottle of orange juice from somewhere, and he handed it to Harry with the matter-of-fact ease that was his particular gift, and Harry took it and drank it, and the three of them sat companionably in the corridor. Grimshaw appeared at Morticia's elbow. "Whatever they decide," she said, "the ministry has a separate matter. Hopkirk pulled me aside during the recess. They're moving to cooperate with the Muggle proceedings." "Cooperate how?" "Fully," Grimshaw said. "They're going to provide a formal acknowledgement of the wizarding institutional failures to the High Court. They want to be seen doing the right thing, which means they've calculated that the right thing is cheaper than the alternative." She paused. "Which is accurate. I told them we'd accept their cooperation and note it." "Good," Morticia said. "The Dursley matter is already moving. Vernon has engaged a solicitor. He's going to fight the more serious criminal charges and negotiate on the civil ones. We'll get most of what we're after." "Petunia?" Morticia asked. Grimshaw's expression did something nuanced. "She's been cooperative since Saturday. Her solicitor has indicated she's preparing a statement of acknowledgement. I think she's trying to get ahead of it." She paused. "She's also, and I'm passing this on without commentary, she's asked about visiting Harry. At some point. If that would ever be appropriate." Morticia was quiet. "That's Harry's decision," she said. "Not mine, not the court's. His." "Agreed. I told them as much." The doors opened. Arabella Fudge took her seat. The committee took theirs. The room reassembled itself with the particular focused silence of people about to hear something they've been waiting for. Fudge looked at her notes, then at the room. "This committee finds as follows," she said. "In the matter of the welfare of Harry James Potter, aged 8 years. First, the documented conditions at the Privet Drive placement constitute a sustained and severe failure of child welfare across 81 identified violations, spanning 6 years, and this committee formally designates them as such for the record of both the wizarding magistracy and, in cooperation with the relevant Muggle authorities, the High Court of England and Wales." She paused. "Second, the Ministry of Magic's Department of Magical Child Welfare failed in its statutory duty to monitor the welfare of a magical minor placed with Muggle guardians. The automatic monitoring system suppression, as evidenced by the documentation presented by Miss Addams this morning, constitutes a deliberate interference with the department's monitoring function. The Ministry is hereby directed to conduct a full review of its monitoring protocols and to report to this committee within 90 days. Another pause. The room was absolutely still. Third, Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore is found to have exercised unilateral and undisclosed authority over the welfare conditions of a magical minor, to have deliberately suppressed the monitoring mechanisms designed to provide independent oversight, and to have failed in his duty of candor to both this committee's predecessor body and to the Ministry. She looked at him. This committee issues a formal and permanent censure, to be recorded in the public register of the wizarding magistracy. Additionally, Dumbledore's authority as Chief Warlock is suspended pending a full review by the Wisengamot, which this committee formally requests. His role as headmaster of Hogwarts is referred to the school's Board of Governors for review. The room breathed in all at once. Fourth, Fudge said, and her voice shifted register slightly, not softer, but more deliberate, and finally, the prospective guardianship application filed by Gomez and Morticia Addams is referred to the High Court for expedited review, with this committee's formal recommendation that it be viewed favorably. This committee notes that the child has been in the direct care of the applicants for the period of these proceedings and that all observations of that arrangement have been, she glanced at a note, positive. She set her papers down. This hearing is concluded. The room erupted. Not dramatically, not into shouting or chaos, but into the particular sound of many conversations beginning simultaneously, which in a stone-walled oval room had a quality like weather. People turned to each other. Tatiana turned to pale and they looked at each other with the expression of people who have just won a case they considered important and are taking a moment to recognize it before moving on. Wednesday closed her notebook and put it in her satchel with the care of someone archiving something significant. Gomez turned to Morticia. She was looking at Harry. Harry had heard the fourth finding. He had heard the words favorable recommendation and prospective guardianship and positive, and his face was not doing the controlled thing at all right now, it was doing the uncontrolled thing, the thing he couldn't help, and what it was the expression of someone who has been told that the thing they were afraid to want is apparently going to happen. He looked at Morticia. He looked at Gomez. Gomez reached over and put his hand on Harry's shoulder, and Harry looked at it, this hand on his shoulder, and then he looked up at Gomez, and he said, "Really?" "Really," Gomez said. Harry made a sound that was not a word and looked at the floor. Morticia looked at this small boy with green eyes and a scar and a piece of paper in his pocket who had stood up in a legal hearing and told the truth with no ornamentation and no strategy, just the clear direct fact of his experience, and she let herself feel what she had been holding since Tuesday. Not pity. Not sorrow, exactly, though there was sorrow in it. Something that was the feeling you get when a thing that should have existed has finally been made to exist, when a gap in the world gets closed, when a letter put on a tree stump by a child who had no reason to believe in answers finally, actually, gets one. She put her hand on Harry's other shoulder. He leaned into it, just slightly, the lean of someone who is checking that the solid thing is solid. It was. Across the room, Dumbledore stood. He was looking at the three of them, Gomez and Morticia and Harry between them, with an expression that had moved past defense, past explanation, past the architecture of justification he'd spent decades building and maintaining. He looked at them with something that was honest and uncomfortable and overdue, which was perhaps the closest thing to accountability a man like that could offer in a single afternoon. He looked at Harry specifically. Harry looked back at him. His face was still doing the uncontrolled thing, but he met the look. He didn't look away. After a moment, Dumbledore turned and walked toward the exit with his colleagues, and he walked as he had entered, straight, precise, still carrying all that institutional authority, but something had changed in the way he wore it, something slight and fundamental, and he would have to figure out what to do with that in private. Wednesday appeared at Harry's other side, which meant he was briefly flanked by two Addams women, which was an unusual position for most people but which Harry seemed to find, inexplicably, entirely appropriate. "The High Court hearing is in 2 weeks," she said to him, which was information but was also her version of well done. "Right," he said. "You should eat something," she said. "You haven't eaten since breakfast." "I'm fine." "You ate one piece of toast." "I'm fine," he said, and then, after a beat, "What is there?" "Gomez knows a place," Wednesday said. "Of course he does," Harry said, and something in his voice had shifted, something small and significant, a quality of ease that hadn't been there before, the quality of someone beginning, slowly and carefully, to know where they are. Chapter 6, Where the Nightshade Grows. 2 weeks is a long time when you're 8 years old and everything is new. Harry learned this over the 14 days between the magistracy hearing and the High Court date, which were the fullest 14 days of his life by a margin so significant it barely bore comparison. The hotel suite became, in that time, less a temporary arrangement and more simply where he lived, not because anyone said so but because the hours filled in the way hours fill when a place is real, with small routines and recurring conversations and the gradual accumulation of a personal geography, which is how anywhere becomes home. He learned that Gomez got up before everyone else and went walking and came back with pastries and strong opinions about the morning. He learned that Morticia worked late and was at her best between midnight and 2 a.m., which Wednesday had told him was genetic. He learned that Wednesday communicated primarily through leaving things, books, notes, relevant documents, occasionally the crossbow in a visible location as a form of commentary, and that this was affection in the specific currency she used for it. He learned that Okafor played a deeply unhinged variant of Snap that Harry was still not winning but was getting better at, and that Pale occasionally read aloud to himself from particularly well-argued judicial opinions in a way that was both unusual and oddly soothing, and that Grimshaw drank 6 cups of tea per day in a very particular order and you did not interfere with the order. He also learned things about himself, in the way you learn things about yourself when the environment that has been telling you who you are changes completely. He learned he had opinions about books. He learned he found fencing, which Gomez started teaching him in the hotel garden on the Saturday after the hearing, with a foil that was somewhat too large for him and a patience that was completely bottomless, genuinely exhilarating in a way that felt related to but separate from the magic that had been happening around him his whole life. He learned he was funny, or could be, in a dry precise way that made Wednesday's mouth do the not-quite-smile thing, which he had come to understand was its highest form. He learned that he was curious about almost everything and that this had apparently always been true and had simply been an inconvenience at Privet Drive and was, it turned out, not an inconvenience here at all. He was also, in the quiet times, afraid. Not the old fear, the waiting for what goes wrong fear, the ducking fear, the make-yourself-small fear. A different fear, newer and more complicated, which was the fear of the thing you want actually happening. The fear that arrives when you realize you have something to lose. He didn't talk about this directly. He circled it, in conversations with Gomez in the garden, in the late-night exchanges with Wednesday over documents and Mortimer the plant, in the questions he asked Morticia at various points during the legal preparations, always framing it sideways, approaching it at an angle. Until one evening, 8 days before the High Court hearing, when Morticia sat down across from him while he was reading and said, without preamble, "You're afraid it's going to be taken away." He looked up. He didn't deny it. "Yes," he said. "Tell me what the fear looks like," she said. He thought about it. "Like, the hearing goes wrong. Or the court decides no. Or something happens with the prophecy and I have to go back." He paused. "Or it goes right and then later something changes and it gets," he stopped. "I don't know how to say it." "You don't know how to trust that something good will hold," Morticia said. He looked at her. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "That is a reasonable fear given your experience," she said. "I am not going to tell you it's irrational, because it would be condescending to do that and also it would be slightly inaccurate." She met his gaze. "What I will tell you is that Gomez and I do not do things provisionally. When we commit to something, we commit completely. It is a quality that has served us well and occasionally alarmed people who were not expecting it." She paused. "We filed a guardianship application. We did not file it as a contingency or a strategy or an institutional protective measure. We filed it because we want you, specifically, Harry, not a child, not a ward, not a responsibility. You." She held his gaze. "That does not go away because a court hearing goes wrong. It does not change because a prophecy is inconvenient. It is simply what is true." He looked at her for a moment. "How do you know?" he said. Not challenging. Genuinely asking. She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Because I read your letter," she said. "And every person who reads your letter wants to answer it. We were just the ones who did." She paused. And because you stood up in a room full of people and told the truth with your hands in your pockets and no notes, and I would be a remarkably poor judge of character if that didn't tell me everything I needed to know about who you are." Harry looked at his book. He looked at it for a while. "Okay," he said, finally. "Good," she said, and picked up her pen. The High Court hearing was on a Tuesday, which Morticia noted was the most honest day of the week, and she told Harry this as they drove, and he looked at her with the expression he sometimes used for things he filed under Addams, which was a category he had been developing in his mind over the past 2 weeks. "What does that mean?" he asked. "Tuesdays don't pretend to be Fridays," she said. "They commit fully to being what they are." He considered this. "I think I might be a Tuesday person," he said. "I think you might," Morticia agreed. The High Court hearing was different from the magistracy in every external way and the same in every essential one. High ceilings and wood paneling and the weight of English law accumulated over centuries in the grain of the furniture. Judge Patricia Holt presided. The Muggle legal machinery had been running in parallel with the wizarding proceedings, the 2 tracks feeding into the same destination: full formal guardianship, full accounting of the Dursley violations, the Ministry's cooperation statement entered into evidence, Grimshaw's comprehensive case laid before a judge who had been reading it since the emergency hearing 2 weeks ago and had, by all available evidence, been reading it very carefully indeed. The Dursley matter was handled first. Vernon's solicitor had negotiated, as Grimshaw had predicted, on the civil violations while contesting several of the criminal charges with the determined energy of a man who understood that the criminal charges were the ones that would follow him. He was not, Morticia had decided, the interesting part of today. He was a man of ordinary cruelty and ordinary cowardice, and the law would address him with the thoroughness it reserved for ordinary cowardice, which was punishment calibrated to magnitude, and the magnitude was considerable. Petunia was different. She had submitted her statement of acknowledgement the week before, a document that Morticia had read and that was, in its way, the most complicated thing she'd read in this entire case, which was saying something. It was not a defense and it was not a tearful confession. It was the statement of a woman who had made specific choices and knew she had made them, and who had spent 2 weeks, perhaps much longer, honestly, perhaps 6 years, looking at what those choices were. It said, "I knew the conditions were not right. I did not act to change them. My reasons were a combination of fear, resentment, and a failure to separate my feelings about my sister from my obligations to her son. None of those reasons are sufficient. I am not asking for them to be considered sufficient." It was the part about the sister that sat most strangely with Morticia. She had thought about Petunia's relationship with Lily Potter in the 2 weeks since Privet Drive, not obsessively but with the steady, honest attention she gave to things that complicated her judgments, and what she had assembled was the portrait of a woman who had loved her sister and lost her to a world that excluded her, and who had turned that loss into something ugly and aimed it at the one person who most reminded her of what she'd lost. It did not excuse the cupboard. Nothing excused the cupboard. But it was the difference between a villain and a human being, and Morticia had decided she was not in the business of flattening people into the shapes that were most convenient for her anger. She did not forgive Petunia. She did not think forgiveness was her call to make. But she looked at the statement and she thought about the sister who had written to them from a tree stump, and the sister who had written her statement with the particular precision of someone who had finally decided to stop maintaining a story, and she thought, these 2 women were not, at the root, entirely unlike. That was not comfort. It was just truth, and truth was what today was for. The guardianship hearing ran in the afternoon, after a lunch break during which Harry ate a sandwich in the High Court cafeteria with Gomez and was introduced to 3 of Grimshaw's legal contacts who happened to be there for other business and who Gomez engaged in conversation with the easy sociability of a man who found every person he met immediately interesting. And Harry watched this and filed it under Gomez in the rapidly expanding internal catalogue he was maintaining. The hearing itself was, compared to the weeks that preceded it, almost quiet. Grimshaw presented the guardianship application. The magistracy's favorable recommendation was submitted. Pale presented the social welfare assessment, an independent evaluation conducted the previous week by a specialist who had spent 4 hours with Harry and had described him in the report as demonstrating remarkable resilience, emerging trust, and a readiness for stable long-term placement. Judge Holt asked questions of Gomez and Morticia directly, which was standard procedure and which both of them navigated with the ease of people who were not uncertain about their answers. She asked Morticia why they had become involved. "We received a letter," Morticia said. "And that was sufficient basis for this level of commitment?" Morticia looked at the judge. "It was a letter written by an 8-year-old child asking to be known," she said. "He wrote it on a tree stump in a school wood and sent it out into the world by the only means available to him, which was hoping." "That was sufficient, yes. Holt wrote something." She asked Gomez what he thought Harry needed. Gomez considered this for a moment, not performing consideration, but actually doing it. "To be someplace where he's wanted for what he is," he said. "Not for what someone needs him to become. He's 8 years old and he's already been told he's important by a man who watched him live in a cupboard. I'd like him to find out what it's like to be told he's important by people who actually mean it." He paused. "Also, I've been teaching him to fence and he has excellent instincts." Holt's expression did something at that last sentence that it then corrected. She asked Harry if he wanted to say anything. Harry had not prepared a statement this time. He looked at Judge Holt, and he said, "I've been there 2 weeks and it's the best 2 weeks I can remember. That's all." Holt looked at him over the top of her glasses for a moment. "All right," she said. She deliberated for 20 minutes. They waited in the hall, all of them, even Grimshaw, who had stopped pretending to work. She granted the order. Full guardianship, effective immediately, with a 6-month review built into the terms as standard procedure, which Grimshaw had told them to expect and which Morticia had already planned for, and a series of access and contact arrangements regarding the wider wizarding world that had been negotiated with the Ministry's cooperation over the previous 2 weeks. When Grimshaw came out of the deliberation room and said, "Granted, full and immediate," Tatiana closed her eyes briefly, which was the most emotion Morticia had ever seen her display. Pale straightened, which was his version of the same thing. Wednesday, who was at the end of the corridor reviewing documents as though she had not been waiting at all, looked up and said, "Good," and went back to her documents. Gomez picked Morticia up. He simply picked her up, right there in the High Court corridor, which was not a place people generally got picked up in, and she laughed, really laughed, which was a rare sound, low and genuine and completely unlike anything she performed, and said, "Gomez, we are in the High Court of England," and he said, "I am aware of where we are, cara mia," and set her down and kissed her hand 3 times, and she shook her head with the expression she reserved for loving something completely. Harry was watching this. He was standing about 4 feet away, watching them, and his face was doing the uncontrolled thing again, but it was a different version from the one in the magistracy hearing. Bigger. Messier. The kind of expression you can't actually hide because it involves your whole face and your whole body and requires sitting with rather than managing. Gomez turned to him and held out his hand, and Harry took it, and Gomez pulled him in and held him by the shoulders and looked at him with the directness he brought to all important things. "You're ours now," he said, simply and completely. "And we are yours. That's the whole of it." Harry made the sound again. The not-a-word sound. Then he put his head down and cried, which he had apparently been saving up for quite some time, and Gomez held on to him with the complete solidity of someone who was not going anywhere, and Morticia came to them and put her hand on Harry's back, and Wednesday arrived from her position at the end of the corridor and stood at the edge of the group, and she did not join the embrace because she was Wednesday, but she was there, fully and completely there, which was her version of it. They flew home the next day. Not by commercial airline, because Gomez had a plane, which was black with red leather interior and a pilot who had been with the family for 20 years and who greeted Harry at the stairs with the formal dignity of someone welcoming a new person to something established and permanent. Harry stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked up at the plane. "It's very black," he said. "Isn't it?" Gomez agreed, with deep satisfaction. I thought planes were usually white. Most things are usually white, Gomez said. It's a choice, not a requirement. Harry considered this and then went up the stairs. The flight was 7 hours and during it Harry slept for 3 of them, deeply and completely, in the wide leather seat, curled on his side with his shoes off, and Morticia worked at the table across the aisle and Gomez read and Wednesday did something on her laptop that she declined to describe and Pale, who had caught the same flight because he had business in New York, read judicial opinions with his customary focus, and the plane flew west over the Atlantic and below it the ocean went on forever in every direction and above it the sky was very clear. Morticia looked at Harry sleeping and felt what she'd been holding since the day she opened a letter written in dried tears. Not project. Not cause. Not the satisfaction of a legal victory or the relief of a good outcome. She felt what she felt when she looked at her children, at Wednesday in her particular completeness, at Pugsley in his enthusiasms, at all the specific, irreducible, non-negotiable reality of them as people who existed and were hers and whose existence she had decided to defend with everything she had. She felt it for Harry. She looked out the window at the ocean and felt it fully, without managing it or directing it anywhere useful, just let it be what it was, which was love in the form it takes when it is both a decision and a fact. Gomez reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her palm up. They flew west. The Addams house announced itself from the car before the car arrived at it. This was not a metaphor. The house had, over its considerable history, developed a quality of presence that extended well beyond its property line, a kind of atmospheric influence that residents of the surrounding area generally referred to as the feeling you get on that road, and which they had largely decided was a trick of the weather or the topography or possibly both. The gates were iron. The drive was long and lined with trees that were remarkable for their blackness at any time of year. The house itself came into view through the trees as the car turned, and Harry, who had been watching the gates and the trees with escalating wide-eyed attention, saw the house. He was quiet for a moment. "It's very tall," he said. 9 stories, Gomez said. 10 if you count the one that isn't always there. Which one isn't always there? That depends on the day, Gomez said cheerfully. Harry pressed closer to the window. The house was old in the way that meant it had simply stopped allowing time to affect it, stone and dark wood and towers and the kind of windows that look like they have opinions. The gardens were extraordinary, black roses, nightshade, plants that Morticia could name in 3 languages, all of them magnificent, none of them what the botanical books called friendly. There were statues. There was a gate within a gate. There was a tree at the eastern corner that had been there longer than the house and that Wednesday had once told Harry, in a letter she'd sent ahead, was named Bernard and that he should introduce himself when they arrived. "Wednesday sent me a letter about the tree," Harry said. "She did?" Morticia said. "She said its name was Bernard and I should introduce myself." Morticia looked at Gomez. Gomez looked at Morticia. "That's accurate," Morticia said. The car stopped. Lurch opened the front door before anyone knocked, which was his standard practice, and stood in the doorway with his height and his general quality of looming benevolence, and Harry, to his credit, did not flinch or step back. He looked up at Lurch, quite a long way up, and said, "Hello." Lurch said, "Jurg," which was warmly inflected. "I'm Harry," Harry said. Lurch said, "Jurg," again, in the tone of "Yes, I know, we've been expecting you." "He's pleased to meet you," Wednesday translated, appearing from behind Lurch with the suddenness that was characteristic of her. She had taken a slightly different flight, the details of which she had not shared, and had apparently arrived first. "How do you know?" Harry asked. His second "Jurg" had a rising intonation, she said. "Come in. I'll show you your room." The room was on the 3rd floor, which had a window that looked out over the garden and its black roses and, on the eastern side, Bernard the tree. It was larger than the hotel room, much larger than a cupboard, his mind noted automatically, and he told that part of his mind to stop noting things by size in comparison to the cupboard. They could stop doing that now, With a four-poster bed with dark curtains and a proper desk and a lamp and a bookshelf that was already half full of books that Wednesday had clearly curated because they were organized in a system that had her fingerprints all over it. There was also a cello in the corner, which he hadn't asked for but which was, it turned out, simply there. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at it. Wednesday stood in the doorway. "The cello is optional," she said. "But there's a lesson room in the West Wing if you want to learn." "I don't know how to play anything," he said. "Neither did I, until I did," she said, which was an Addams kind of argument that he had already started recognizing as such, meaning it was simultaneously circular and entirely correct. He turned to look at the window. Outside, in the late afternoon, the garden was doing what the garden did, which was exist with a particular charged quality, as if all the plants were very awake, as if the light moving through the nightshade was doing it with some purpose. The black roses were extraordinary in the afternoon sun. Bernard the tree was very large and, now that he was looking at it, did have a quality about it. He opened the window. He leaned out slightly. "Bernard," he said. The tree made no sound. But something about the quality of the air shifted briefly, in the way that might have been wind or might have been a response, depending on what you were prepared to accept. "I'm Harry," he said. "I live here now." He stayed leaning out the window for a moment, and then he came back in and sat on the edge of the bed and pressed his hand flat on the duvet, which was a gesture he'd made on every new surface since the hotel, testing solidity, and the bed was solid. Wednesday was still in the doorway. "Is it real?" he asked. Not meaning the bed. "Yes," she said. "A real place," he said. "Not just better." "Entirely real," she said. "Very strange. Occasionally dangerous, depending on the floor." "Real." He looked at the room. "Okay," he said. It was the same word he'd been using since the hotel, but it meant something different each time, and this time it meant "I believe it." Dinner at the Addams house on the first night was not a quiet affair, which was to say it was exactly what it was every night, which was the most alive thing happening on the eastern seaboard. The table was long and lit with candles, not electric light, not unless someone had specifically requested it, which nobody had, and the food was extraordinary, prepared by a kitchen that operated on principles Morticia had spent years developing, which were, everything should be excellent, presentation matters, and several of the ingredients should be things a reasonable person would not consider food but which were in fact both delicious and fascinating. Harry had been warned about this by Wednesday in one of her pre-arrival letters, in the specific wording the food is unusual but not dangerous, or at least not intentionally, and he had taken this at face value and eaten dinner in the hotel with appropriate bravery, and it had been, in fact, excellent. Tonight it was more excellent, because they were home, and things tasted different when you were home. Pugsley had been there when they arrived, back from a 3-week visit to a cousin, which had apparently involved a significant amount of explosives and a legal matter in 3 states that Gomez had resolved by telephone from England with his customary grace, and he had introduced himself to Harry with the direct enthusiasm of someone who had been told a new person was coming and had thought about it for 2 weeks and had opinions. "Wednesday says you're interesting," he said, which was high praise in the Addams Family assessment scale. "I don't know if I am yet," Harry said. "I think I'm just starting to find out." Pugsley nodded, recognizing this as a satisfactory answer, and that was the whole of the introduction, which was appropriate and efficient and established the correct register for their relationship going forward. At the table, Gomez told 3 stories from the legal proceedings, each of which he rendered with increasing dramatic energy until Morticia said, "Gomez," and he scaled back approximately 10%. Wednesday recounted the archive findings with the deadpan precision that made the story better rather than worse. Pugsley asked questions that were technically about the legal proceedings but were in fact primarily about the Ministry of Magic's security protocols and what precisely they were built on, which was a professional interest. Harry ate. He ate fully and with the deep appreciation of someone who had spent years in a house where food was a controlled resource and who was only now beginning to shift out of the habit of eating as though it might be taken back. Morticia had noted this habit in the hotel and had simply ensured, without comment, that food was always available and never rationed and never pointed at, and it was beginning, slowly, in the way habits of survival unwind, to change. At some point in the evening, during a lull in the conversation, Harry said, "I want to find out about my parents." Everyone at the table looked at him. "Not tonight," he said. "Just, eventually. I want to know who they were. Really were, not what Dumbledore thinks about them or the story people tell about what happened. Who they actually were." Morticia looked at him. "We'll find out," she said. "Together?" he asked. "Together," she said. He nodded. He picked up his fork. "What was my mum like?" he said, and looked at the table, and then looked up. "She was brave," Morticia said. "And she was a witch of extraordinary ability. And she loved you so much that her love became the most powerful protective magic known." Harry was quiet. "She chose you," Gomez said. "Fully and consciously. She made a decision in her last moments that protected you. That's who she was." Harry pressed his lips together briefly, the brief controlled thing. "And my dad?" "Loyal," Wednesday said, from her end of the table, without looking up from her food. "Quick. Good at Quidditch, according to historical accounts." Harry looked at her. "Was he funny?" Wednesday considered this. "He thought he was," she said. Pugsley laughed. Harry laughed too, the lopsided surprised laugh, the one that was still finding its feet, and the sound of it went up into the high-ceilinged dining room and the candles burned and the house held them all. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, Minerva McGonagall arrived at the front gate. Not announced, not invited, she had apparently found the address through channels that Tatiana described as concerning but not entirely surprising, and she had come alone, in her traveling robes, with the expression of someone who has been thinking about something for a long time and has finally decided to stop thinking and do it. Morticia received her in the drawing room. Not the formal drawing room, which was for visiting legal teams and the rare occasion when someone from the ministry arrived in person. The actual drawing room, with Morticia's roses on the side table and her pruning shears and the chairs that were arranged for conversation. McGonagall sat. She held her hat in her lap. She was a controlled woman, Morticia recognized it, the specific quality of control that comes from decades of holding a large institution and a great number of people together by sheer force of competence and will. She looked at Morticia with the directness of someone accustomed to difficult conversations and not in the habit of circling them. "I came to see him," she said. "I know," Morticia said. "He should know," McGonagall stopped. Started again. "There are people who knew his parents. Who knew them as people, not as symbols. James and Lily deserved better than to become what they've become in the wizarding narrative, which is a story rather than a history." She looked at her hat. "I was there the night of the original assessment. I spent all day watching that street, watching those people, and I told Albus directly that it was wrong." Her jaw tightened. "And then I trusted him, which I have had a great deal of time to think about." "You did," Morticia said. Without absolution or indictment, simply acknowledging the fact. "I can't give him back those years," McGonagall said. "No one can. But I can tell him who his parents were. I can tell him what his mother was like in my transfiguration class, the specific quality of how her mind worked. I can tell him that his father was an incorrigible troublemaker who became, in his last years, someone who might have been remarkable." She looked at Morticia. "I think he should have that." Morticia held her gaze for a moment. "That's Harry's choice," she said. "I know. That's why I came to ask." Morticia stood. She went to the door of the drawing room and said, "To the hallway, Harry." A pause. Footsteps on the stairs. Harry came down from the 3rd floor, still in his morning clothes, a book in his hand, with the slightly distracted quality of someone who had been deep in reading. He came into the drawing room and saw McGonagall and stopped. McGonagall looked at him. She looked at him with an expression that was doing several things, reading him, taking the measure of him, but also something more personal than that, something that involved recognition. "You look like your father," she said. "Around the jaw. But your eyes are your mother's exactly." Harry looked at her. "You knew them." "I taught them both. Your father for 7 years and your mother from her first day." She held his gaze. "I'm Minerva McGonagall. I was there the night you were brought to Privet Drive, and I told the man who brought you there that it was a mistake. I have regretted not doing more than saying so every day since." Harry looked at her. He looked at Morticia. Morticia said nothing. She simply held the door open, which was all the permission required, and Harry looked back at McGonagall. "Will you tell me about them?" he said. "Not the story. What they were actually like." "Yes," said McGonagall, with a precision that contained everything. "Yes. That's exactly why I'm here." Harry came into the room and sat down, and McGonagall began, and Morticia stepped back to the doorway and let them have it. Gomez found her later, in the garden, standing near the black roses with her shears, deadheading with the steady meditative attention she gave to this particular task. "McGonagall is still there," he said. "She and Harry have been talking for 2 hours." "Good." He stood beside her. She handed him a cut stem, black rose, fully open, at the peak, and he put it in his buttonhole with the ease of someone accepting a perfectly appropriate gift. "The High Court review is in 5 months, he said. "I know. We'll be ready." "We're always ready," she said. He looked at the garden. Evening was coming in, the light going amber and long-shadowed, the nightshade catching it in a way that made it look almost incandescent. Somewhere in the house, through an open window, the sound of McGonagall's voice came out, measured, telling something, the quality of someone reconstructing a person from the inside out so they could be known properly. "He asked about his parents at dinner 3 weeks ago," Morticia said. "He said together. When I said we'd find out, he said together, as if he needed to be sure the finding out was a thing we'd do with him rather than for him." "Did that surprise you?" "It told me something," she said. "About what he needed most, which was not answers so much as the process of getting answers, which is different. Answers can be given. The process has to be shared." She cut a stem. "He knows that. Somehow, after everything, he knows that." Gomez looked at the garden. He was quiet in the thoughtful way, the way that meant something was assembling itself. "You know what I think," he said. "Tell me." "I think the letter reached us because it was supposed to." "I don't say that in a mystical way. I don't mean destiny. I find destiny tedious. I mean that it reached us because he sent it without expectation of response, which is the only way you ever send something true, and because we are the specific people who would receive a letter like that and not put it down." He turned to look at her. "Not many people would have done what you did with it. You know that." She looked at the roses. "Someone should have done it years ago," she said. "Yes. But they didn't, and we did, and he's upstairs listening to a woman who knew his parents tell him what they were really like, and in the morning he'll come down and eat breakfast and probably argue with Wednesday about something, and it will be ordinary." She felt him take her hand. "Ordinary good is the rarest thing," he said. "You made it." She looked at the roses. She felt the weight of the shears in her hand and the evening light and the sound of the house behind them, full and real and alive. "We made it," she said. He kissed her wrist. The garden held the light as long as it could, and then let go, and the first stars came. Later that night Harry sat at the window of his room looking at the garden in the dark, and Bernard the tree was very still, and the nightshade was pale in the moonlight, and the house made its sounds around him, the creak of old wood, the distant sound of Gomez and Morticia talking in the hall below, something that might have been Pugsley in the cellar and might have been the house settling, and Wednesday's light still on in the room at the end of the corridor because Wednesday did not sleep. At ordinary times. He sat with all of it. He had the paper crane in his hand, the one Wednesday had folded and sent through the vent at Privet Drive, the one that said evidence is being gathered, you are not alone. He'd carried it since then. He turned it in his fingers. He thought about the letter. The one he'd written on the tree stump, the one he'd folded and tied and put out into the world for a raven to take because he had nothing else, and he'd read about a family in a library book and thought, maybe. He thought about what it meant that the maybe had answered. He put the crane on the windowsill, where the moonlight caught it. He left it there, not getting rid of it, never that, but putting it somewhere visible, somewhere it could be seen rather than carried, because the thing it meant had changed. It wasn't the last of something anymore. It was the beginning of something, and beginnings should be visible. He looked at the garden. Okay, he said, to no one, to himself, to Bernard the tree who might or might not be listening, to the house and the nightshade and the first real place he had ever been, and what he meant by it this time was not I can manage this or I'll wait and see or I understand. What he meant was, I'm here. And the house, which was very old and had held a great many things in its long stone life, held that too.